Sterne's Tristan Shandy. Robert Alter will be presenting a paper title called Sterne's Tristan Shandy, Derrida's Jacques, les fatalistes et son maître, and Nabokov's Pnin, the comic novel in light of Morson's wonder and certainty. After which, Dalya Sachs-Bernstein will be presenting the Dalya from the Dalya State, Sonoma County, California, will be presenting a paper entitled "From Literature to Life: An Essayistic Treatment to a Friendship." After which, Steve Shankman from the University of Oregon will be presenting a paper entitled "Ideology, Small Acts of Kindness, and Maternity in Vasily Grossman's Stalingrad." And so without further ado, let's begin. I'd like to invite Dr. Robert Alter up to the panel stage. Thank you.
Thank you, Brad. Am I audible? Yeah. Now, I was told that Saul hasn't come back from the restroom yet, which puts me in mind of a lecture I gave here at Northwestern. It must have been almost 50 years ago. Of course, Saul was not at Northwestern yet. My wife accompanied me to Chicago with our then infant son. And I came across town to Evanston first, but while she waited for a babysitter. And she hadn't arrived yet when my lecture was supposed to begin. So my dear late friend, Alfred Appel, who was to introduce me, sort of riffed for 15 minutes until my wife arrived without the baby. Well, I trust, Saul's now here. Okay, so I don't have to riff. And I better take out my watch to now, let me explain one thing about this talk. I sent in the abstract before I realized that the talks were limited to 20 minutes. So I stipulated 3 comic novels. Now, had I known it was 20 minutes, I probably would have done 1 comic novel, but I'll simply have to treat them in drastic summary. Now, comedy, of course, has a great deal to do with the dissolution of ideology. It dissolves ideology. And since a lot of comedy has to do with the lower functions of the human body, and I'll get into that in just a couple of minutes, that brings us back to Bakhtin and Bakhtin's account of realism emerging in the medieval French fabliaux. And in fact, one of the 3 novels I will discuss, Jacques le Fataliste, is strongly influenced by the fabliaux. Okay, now, Saul does not really discuss comic novels in his wonderful new book, but that makes sense because he's using the great Russian realists as the major counter against the certitude of ideology and state terrorism and other kinds of terrorism. So the comic novels don't quite fit. But I think that the comic novels I'll try to show in a few minutes are very relevant to the argument of Saul's book. So I'll do them in chronological order, beginning with Tristram Shandy, which came out in parts beginning in the 1760s, and then with Diderot's Jacques le fataliste et son maître, which is just a few years later, and in fact, Diderot much admired Sterne so much that he plagiarized 2 or 3 pages from Tristram and Shandy, admitting that it was plagiarism in the text of his novel. Okay, now, all you Russianists, of course, are aware of Shklovsky's famous declaration that Tristram Shandy is the most typical novel of world literature, which was meant as a kind of provocation. And I believe I could be corrected by about this, that what Shklovsky had in mind, if I remember the essay, is the bearing of artifice, okay? But I think it's also critical in the stance it takes, not exactly against ideology, which wasn't so much around in Sterne's milieu in the 18th century, but what Saul calls theoretism. That is, Papa Shandy, referred to as my father throughout the novel, is an advocate of theoretism with a vengeance. He has a theory about everything, and he has plans that are dictated in part or in whole by the theory. So the novel begins this way. He tries to regulate his household on the domestic equivalent of a 5-year plan, except in his case, it's a 25-year plan. And we're told at the very beginning that there are two domestic obligations that he discharges. I think it's the last Sunday night of every month. One is to wind the clock, and the other is to discharge his conjugal obligation to his wife. So at the beginning, we have the following. We're not given much context for this deliberately. He says, my father, I'm sorry, she says, my mother, "May, my dear," quoth my mother, "have you not pray, my dear," quoth my mother, "have you not forgot to wind up the clock?" "Good God!" cried my father, making an exclamation, but taking care to moderate his voice at the same time. Did ever woman, since the creation of the world, interrupt a man with such a question? Then, what was, then the reader intervenes, then what was your father saying? Nothing. So it begins hilariously this way, and it sets up the model for what will occur again and again with ingenious variations, which is my father projects schemes, plans, confirmations of his theory, and they always get interrupted because reality isn't that way. I think that's one reason. Probably another would be a personal obsession of Sterne's, that impotence and this interrupted coitus is a kind of intimation of that impotence is so important throughout the novel, and threats to the male member. There's a hilarious moment when little Tristram needs to pee, and he tells Susanna, the maid, that there's no chamber pot in the room. So she says, "Piss out the window." So he advances to the window, and the window sash collapses, and he gets circumcised. So at that point, the narrator comments, "Nothing in our household is well hung." Now, the last time I reread Tristram and Shandy, I thought, well, maybe that's just a coincidence that they didn't say that in the 18th century, but I consulted the trusty Oxford English Dictionary. I found out that well hung in the sexual sense we use it was current since the 17th century, at first applied to horses. So we have a series of disruptions throughout the novel. Birth, the manner of birth, sex, naming, everything goes awry. And there's a kind of summary toward the end of the novel. We live in a world beset on all sides with mysteries and riddles. And theoretism or theories cannot really manage that. Then Jacques la Fataliste. Now, that may be a little less familiar to some of you. It actually wasn't even published in Diderot's lifetime. Well, I won't summarize the whole thing, but Jacques is the servant of an army officer, and he's been taught by his previous boss, a captain, that everything is written in a great scroll on high. In other words, all human events are predetermined. And the force of the novel is to demonstrate that this couldn't possibly be true, that reality is arbitrary and unpredictable, and at times quirky. Again, one sentence quote from the novel: "Nature is so varied, especially in instincts and characters, that there's nothing in the imagination of a poet for which experience and observation do not offer you a model in nature." So the unpredictable imagination of the poet corresponds better to reality than the philosophers who spin theories and explain things, for example, by a deterministic symptom. Repeatedly, sex is the source of comedy in Diderot's novel, which, as I alluded to at the beginning of remarks, had precedent in the medieval fabliaux. But if you stop to think about it for a moment, sex is a zone of unpredictability in human life, where life doesn't correspond to theory or to a system of determinism. Of course, there's the matter of impotence, which is not really very important in Diderot, although there are some passing allusions to it. But then there's the imperiousness and the improvisatory character of desire. Then there is, drawing on the Fablio tradition, the fact that that sex is an area where deception, disguise, downright deceit, and so forth proliferate. And I'll just mention one particularly amusing example of the novel. Jacques tells the story that when he was maybe in his late teens and already had some sexual experience, he meets two housewives at a local market. And he tells them that he's innocent as the driven snow. He has no idea what a woman really is. And so the two young housewives are intrigued by this, and they think this is an excellent opportunity to offer the young man some education. So he'll meet with one and then with the other. The first one, Marguerite, takes him to a private place, and then she takes his hand and slips it under her skirt between her legs. At which point Jacques says, "Mais, il n'y a rien là-bas." There's nothing there. At which point Jacques' master says, "Jacques, you scoundrel!" Because obviously he's just maintaining the pose of the innocent when he's using that as a sexual dodge. Okay, now I'm observing my time limits strictly. I will move on to Pnin. As close as I can, I will get to the Russian novel. Of course, it was written in the United States in the 1950s in the American phase of Nabokov, and actually the first 4 chapters were published episodically in The New Yorker. Now, Pnin is, for those of you who don't know the novel, it is a Russian emigre who is a painfully misfit professor at a fictitious, probably upstate New York college. And he has struggled to understand America, and he's also struggled to master the English language, neither of which he ever achieves. So the misfit between the Russian Pnin and his American environment are a repeated source of comedy. It's at times a kind of painful comedy or a melancholy comedy. Or I think that Nabokov, as author, not his narrator, has great sympathy for Pnin. This disjuncture between Pnin and his environment is the occasion for a literary technique of which Nabokov was a past master, which is I'm sorry, I just lost my place in my notes. Defamiliarization. And the defamiliarization here comes because Pnin doesn't understand his environment, this strange American environment. And many of these moments are really quite funny. Like, for instance, Pnin sees, I quote, a curious basket-like net, somewhat like a glorified billiard pocket, lacking, however, a bottom, which suspended above the garage door. So, of course, he just can't make out what the hell these Americans are doing with this contraption, because he knows nothing about basketball. He grew up in an era before American pro basketball players were spending off seasons in Russia. Now, at some points, the defamiliarization is a mix between Pnin and the narrator, and you're not quite sure who is responsible. For example, when he goes to a bus stop, he sees two lumpy old ladies in semi-transparent raincoats like potatoes in cellophane. Okay, that speaks for itself, I hope. And I will maybe just give you one more example. In the house where he's renting a room, there's one of the, I don't think they're around much anymore, but they're one of those washing machines that has a circular window on the front door, and you can see what's going on as the machine is working. And Pnin has never seen anything like this, and he's fascinated by it. So he likes to stand in front of the machine while it's working, experiencing, quote, the joy of watching through that porthole what looked like an endless tumble of dolphins with the staggers. So throughout the novel, there are all kinds of hilarious moments like this, which ideology or theoretism is not really a presence in this novel, but what you have is received ways of seeing the world, and the comedy disrupts those ways and makes you see the world in a different way. I would just add about Pnin that it is a comic novel that's unusual because it's tinged with sadness. Pnin has had a troubling life. His first love apparently perished in a concentration camp, and the woman to whom he is briefly married mistreats him and then jilts him, and of course he's treated as a standing joke in the novel by everybody else in this community. You feel all along that he doesn't deserve this treatment, that he's the moral superior of everyone around him. So that's the way in which the comedy challenges how people conventionally think about things and think about people. So I would say that that Pnin's baffled sense of the world around him is a manifestation of his stubbornly individual sense of things, the morality of his not belonging to the hackneyed academic world around him. So it's another kind of resistance to a prevailing system, and I think that's characteristic of the comic novel in general. It's an amusing, bracing way to say that reality is more bizarre, more complicated, more zany than the ideologues tell us it is. Thank you.
Okay, good afternoon.
You're good. We're using lapels now because it allows us to sound better.
Bear with me for a moment. I've decided to make this the first
Do
time.
you have a...
Am I audible or not audible? Perhaps that's a switch.
Go ahead, start talking.
Am I audible now?
No.
Am I audible now? Still no.
Oh, yeah.
This is definitely audible.
Perhaps we're swapping.
We can always go back if it's too complicated. We're managing.
How about now? Okay. The only forgiveness I'll ask is forgiveness that this is the first time I've ever used PowerPoint. I've decided to inaugurate that skill here. Would you just come back for a quick second and let me know if this is the button that I pushed to make it go? That one?
It should be.
It's that button? Great. Thanks so much. Okay. Well, I wonder if there's a slightly uncomfortable, ominous weight of pending obsolescence to being the subject of a career celebration. That's the question preoccupying, I knew it. That's the question preoccupying fictional author Alexander Garber in my late husband Michael Andre Bernstein's novel Conspirators. When Garber's publishers announced they're issuing a new collected works, Garber's anxious musings open the novel. Crossing into middle age, a successful writer is expected to enter his custodial phase, in which he services and maintains his prior accomplishments. Is that really what he was agreeing to now? Saul, you may be slightly astonished I'm situating you as middle-aged, and I certainly hope... Why not? Keep going, my friend. I certainly hope you're unperturbed collecting the accolades this conference is conferring at every turn. But I do know you're not remotely surprised to hear me speak in loco Michaelis, giving voice to Michael's words to begin my own remarks. Were Michael alive, we both know he would be at the microphone here today, alongside his other dearest friend, Bob Alter, and he would have brought a sparkling wit to the joyous task of calling out your achievements. What I have to say is not an assessment of Saul's academic and literary impact, but a consideration of the words and the man as inseparable, adopting or adapting the stance of a great literary hero for us both, Michel de Montaigne, when he said, "C'est moi que je peins, je suis moi-même la matière de mon livre. It is myself I portray. I myself am the subject of my book." This metaphoric mode, let's call it living essayistically, is something Saul the man and Saul the writer embodies. It's emblematic of the link between you, Michael, and myself. Friendship without quotation marks. Saul and Michael's literary and personal conversation started in 1969 at Oxford and still hasn't ended. Saul, you're with me on that, right? For over 40 years, you were friends. Michael was the best man at both your first and your last and best wedding. You were interlocutors, collaborators, developing in dialogue with one another the concepts of prosaics, side-shadowing, and back-shadowing. I have been told it's very unfortunate I was on the other side of the camera taking that picture. Leap with me to Saul's Words of Others, a book published shortly before Michael died. Saul, you ask at the close of the prologue, can one even think without the words of others? It's a rhetorical question you spend the next few hundred pages answering, no, not possible. We think by orchestrating utterances to which quotation marks cling more or less securely in our inner dialogues. Phrases still felt to be another's interact with those we have made half ours, half someone else's. And you wrote me an email in August of 2008, Michael is such a presence in my thoughts that I can hardly think of any topic without imagining what he has said or would say. And I, Saul, can hardly think about you without thinking about the conversations you and he shared in person and in print. Speaking of conversation, who knew a word could be practically patented? We too, and dare I say, the happy few, identify this word powerfully with Michael. Back in 1990, when Michael and Saul were exploring prosaics in the early stages of the collaborative project that birthed the terms side-shadowing and back-shadowing and eventually resulted in Michael's foregone conclusions and Saul's narrative freedom, Michael delivered a lecture entitled Foreshadowing and the Ethics of Narrative. As far as I know, that was the first appearance of a simple phrase that became a leitmotif in Michael's subsequent work, and I quote him. Once, on a panel in literary theory, I was asked how I would define my own approach, and the only answer I could offer that seemed to me properly responsive to the works that compelled me to curiosity was to keep the conversation going. This phrase recurs in Michael's writing, and it also reverberates in Saul's. It's in his publications, talks, even some emails. And I assure you all, every time Saul voices this phrase, it functions on multiple levels. It does what it says, namely, participates in the practice of never-ending intellectual inquiry. But there's another thing happening, a certain self-talk that reanimates citationally the man he and I both love dearly. Let me double down on Montaigne as an instructive model, because there's something about how he lived, thought, and wrote that literally, physically, kept the conversation going. Montaigne inserted quotations not only into his own writing, but he also adorned the ceiling beams of his personal man cave writing tower with quotations of the literary icons with whom he wanted to stay in conversation. Saul and Michael adorned their friendship with one another's words. The longing to speak with someone you loved who's no longer alive is a heavy, harsh experience. It's something you articulated, Saul, poignantly as you concluded your eulogy at the UC Berkeley Memorial for Michael in December of 2011. When Michael knew he was dying, he expressed regret that he would no longer be able to observe and comment on the magnificent, varied, and endlessly interesting human pageant of our vanities and desires. I can't help thinking that he's still watching us and commenting wryly on his own funeral. I anticipate with pleasure and dread the chance to question him about our lives, argue with him, experience how he could listen to me better than I've heard myself, and then to do what he thought of as the most important thing, in his phrase, to keep the conversation going. One of my personal favorite lines, in the words of others, that I think rises to the level of aphorism is, "We are what we have de-italicized." It is a profound way of transforming the platitude that imitation is the sincerest form of flattery into something else that reflects why you dedicated that book to Michael. Because some of his words continue to pulse in your mind, and you take pleasure in effacing the traces of quotation marks. Just as Montaigne conferred the highest honor he could conceive when he offered up space in the essays corpus, which he explicitly identified as a self-portrait, to his dearest friend, Etienne Laboissy, inserting his deceased friend's writing directly into the essays. Saul, each time you embed that iconic phrase of Michael's about keeping the conversation going in a composition of your own, it's as if you layer Michael into your own self-portrait, like an underpainting whose contours are invisible but confer depth and dimension. This is surely just a partial list, but I can point to several very meaningful recurrences. It's in the epigraph of Minds Wide Shut, the book you co-authored with Morty Shapiro. The introduction to Prosaics and Other Provocations concludes with de-italicized Michael. Quote, "Our greatest tool for understanding is dialogue, and the most important thing is to keep the conversation going." Attribution would only diminish the impact. A playful plagiarizing, a habit of inserting one another's lines with a wink works both ways. One of Saul's alter ego pseudonyms, Alicia Chudo, springs to life in Michael's novel, Conspirators. And it isn't a stretch to see Saul himself described there. Chudo had impressed him with her wit and a wickedly disabused lucidity that saw the absurdity in her own camp as much as the evil in her enemies. She was the most theoretically minded person he had ever met, but the savingly fantastical aspect from his point of view was that her principal thesis seemed to be the extreme perniciousness of any tendency to over-theorize. You recognize the man? If there were any doubt about Saul making a kind of cross-dressing cameo appearance, it's erased entirely when we hear Chudo use de-italicized, the title of one of Saul's own books. While devouring a third piece of Austrian cake, something I know Michael watched his friend Saul do many a time, and with at least twice as many accompanying strong cups of coffee, Chudo speaks intensely. The only truth that matters is always already there in front of us, hidden in plain view and unrecognized, not because of its complexity, but because of its very ordinariness. We spend all our time looking for some mysterious law or pattern underneath human existence and are so blind to the random, haphazard contingencies that end up shaping who we are and what kind of world we're making. And with admirable timing, both her speech and the last piece of cake came to an end. It's so much fun to implant these Easter eggs for one's favorite familiar readers and for oneself. Perhaps Saul was doubly de-italicizing, referencing himself and referencing Michael, referencing him in Conspirators, when he comments in Prosaics and other provocations, quote, "Cloaked in their ordinariness, the truths we seek are hidden in plain view." But allow me now to quote Michael directly, to broadcast his assessment of Saul in a context that demanded not so much the playful as the persuasive. In a letter Michael wrote at the request of the University of Chicago, when that competitor university was trying to lure Saul from this campus to theirs, we can hear the esteem in which Michael held Saul, and I want to share with you now some of his high praise. Narrative and freedom, the shadows of time offers nothing less than a new way to conceive of the relationship between temporality, narrative structures, and human freedom itself. It is an astonishingly wide-ranging book with deep and central implications for every aspect of the humanities, and it has by now assumed the stature of a masterpiece of theoretical and practical criticism. That he should be able to write critical texts of such rigor and sophistication and then compose a brilliantly witty text like "And Quiet Flows the Vodka," which virtually reinvents the classical mode of literary criticism through parody and imitation, is an achievement of major dimension. Long established as one of the most consistently engrossing critics of his generation, Morson is on the way, I think by now he's arrived, but at the time, on the way to becoming more central with each new publication. For those of us who write at a slower pace, he is almost alarmingly prolific, combining the roles of critic, teacher, editor, and administrator with equal facility and to the detriment of none of them. Thanks. You know, there was some rhetorical slant here. I've been struck again by his rare combination of scrupulous theoretical sharpness and imaginative sympathy with points of view different from his own. For all of these reasons, I cannot imagine a scholar with comparable areas of expertise to whom I would rate more highly than Gary Saul Morson. And I know from my colleagues that were a position in Slavic Complet to open at Berkeley, Morson would be the first one we would contact about filling it. If he's interested enough in the University of Chicago to consider leaving Northwestern for it, I can only congratulate you on your good fortune and urge the significance of his ample credentials with all my confidence. Saul's and my friendship began at first one-sidedly, from me towards Saul, in the many years before Michael introduced me. Lengthy phone calls between Saul and me began very soon after Michael informed Saul of my existence. Saul sought me out, curious about me, and also treasuring fuller insight into the friend whose genius I believe he esteemed above all others in his life. Ever since, words and confidences have cycled back and forth between us, like a modernized epistolary novel. Phone calls, email threads, eulogies, wedding vows. Saul has stood in loco Michaelis as well at my daughter's bat mitzvah. He has supplied last-minute edits when I was on a train to Oxford just hours from delivering a lecture there. And he even weighed in on my online dating profile. It worked. I'm remarried now to the man standing in the back of the room here today, whose first read of me was that snippet autobiography I uploaded to the app only after Saul endorsed it for verisimilitude. He lent the patriarch gravitas to our wedding, reading from Bob's translation of the Song of Songs. He never misses sending birthday messages to Michael's and my daughters. But we were engaged in conversation long before Saul realized. Years before Saul met me, I had been editing everything his dear friend and my love interest Michael wrote. And Michael, in turn, passed along to me the manuscript of Saul's section of the book he and Michael were writing together. Michael's section became Foregone Conclusion and Saul's Narrative Freedom. I wrote all my suggested edits on Post-its. In a first pass, later Michael combined with his own responses and shared with Saul. For some reason, just after Michael's funeral in May of 2011, I decided impulsively to tell Saul those edits had come secretly from me. I even told him I had thought the early draft was riddled with purple prose, and Michael had captured a photo of me frowning while marking up the manuscript during a trip to Sicily. The week after the funeral, Saul and I corresponded via email about Michael loaning me out decades earlier to edit his work unseen and unknown. The dialogue we exchanged is emblematic of the two friendships referenced, Saul's with Michael and with me. Dear Dalya, I had not known you were marking up the early drafts of my side-shadowing chapters, and I'm sure you were right about some purple prose. When I write, I do that, and then have to edit it out, then edit some more out, reminding myself of Dr. Johnson's advice to young writers. Look through your work until you find a passage that's particularly fine, and then get rid of it. Your eye, like so much about you, is keen. Dear Saul, it's testament to your love of Michael and the respect and friendship you've always extended to me on his account that your response to the disclosure about the early editing of the side-shadowing chapters was to be charmed rather than irritated. I realize only reading your email that the story might instead have given offense, but you always gave Michael the benefit of the doubt, the benefit of your devotion. And I can tell that you now realize, knowing many of the comments that came to you from Michael, not a plurality but a number to be fair, originated with me, and that you feel all the closer to me for it, rather than estranged from Michael or vexed with me. Dear Dalya, benefit of the doubt? I guess so. I loved Michael so much that even on the rare occasions he irritated me, I thought it would be better to see why he said what he did, and I always learned something. Your comment was painful for a split second, and then I was totally charmed by you and it. I think that represents the sequence of my feelings well, and I do feel all the closer to you. Remember that I always knew Michael did things better than I did, so how could another case of that shake me or my love for him? The eulogy was in the form of notes. I had notes for a lot more, and then just selected what seemed to fit the moment. Actually, I went into a kind of trance, conscious of faces, yours and the girls', but mostly going by feel after reading that quotation I brought to get me started. I was pretty sure I'd use that somewhere and anticipated closing about, quote, keeping the conversation going, since that is what I hoped to say to him. I used to say to Michael, and I knew, and he knew I would, that one has to remember what is really important in this world. And for me, that is the people who matter the most. There were lots of times with Michael when my thoughts would start out in one direction and then would, so to speak, Michaelize under his gaze. I felt it at the funeral. I saw it in your eyes. I hear his voice quoted in yours. Saul, we notice all the Michaelizing either of us ever engages in, and it puts the sweet in bittersweet. Almost 4 years ago, when you emailed me your Chekhov essay, The Poet of Loneliness, I wrote back telling you, meanwhile, I just read your essay and I can hardly thank you enough for sending it. We're in conversation, and the multiple levels and years and media through which that conversation extends is so important to me. I can feel you and Michael and me in surreal communion. You, unaware of the exact moment I've been reading your words, written at moments with Michael, and me too, so Tosca, pronunciation, I don't know, from your space, but so present in your memory and mind. I do not think that I have ever, I mean ever, read a better line to crystallize Hi there, Michael. It was a favorite word of his. What reading literature does and means, then yours here. Quote, that is one purpose of great literature, to help us recognize and so be conscious of what we experience but do not really notice. I am on my feet applauding, admiring the elegance and insight. So many lines of yours receive the highlight treatment from me. Here are some I marked, and I have printed this exactly as it was in my email. We live missing something, longing for something, though we do not always know what. Nature itself seems to call out its loneliness. No matter how long one journeys, one seems to make no progress and cannot help wondering whether time itself might congeal and stop. The beauty of human sadness and unanswerable questions. Silence, too, is part of the song. Desolation is slow, uneventful, and moody. In this apocalypse of small things, the predominant feeling is that of pointless waste. Life's real tragedy is prosaic, and Chekhov describes how individual lives are wasted prosaically. Plays traditionally featured uninterrupted action, but Chekhov created dramas of inaction, where the most common stage direction, his own trademark, is a pause. The only thing that happens in Chekhov's play The Three Sisters, one critic remarked, is that three sisters do not go to Moscow. Dramas misrepresent the world precisely because they are dramatic. But the really significant events are the small ones we barely notice, the kindnesses we forget to extend, the attention we do not pay, the opportunities we miss, and the inevitable waste that our omissions entail. That part there is highlighted in green instead of the blue I used for everything else because it is so fucking smart and so replete with Michaelness that I think you must have quivered when you wrote it, feeling some dual resonance of his voice and yours blending. Almost indecent if you ask me, but I'll forgive the posthumous indiscretion. My dear Saul, I can hardly remember not being in conversation with you, and speaking here today is an honor I will always treasure. I want to close by sharing one of the ways that I personally riff on Montaigne's approach to his beloved friend La Boétie and his beloved authors, as it captures how I try to honor Michael's dearest friendships and will go on the rest of my life remembering how you too have listened to me better than I have understood myself sometimes, and will go on with your words and mine in dialogue. This was written to Saul, Bob Alter, Herbert Marx, together. My dear friends, I spent the last few days building bookcases from IKEA in my new bedroom here in Austin. There's now a wall of books that runs floor to ceiling for 16 feet, and it's the first time I've seen most of my books since packing them up in Oakland. I'm sending you, three dearest friends, a picture of one shelf that holds some of Michael's, some of Saul's, some of Bob's, some of Herb's books, as well as an MLN article of mine and the bound copy of my dissertation. I know you three understand what I mean when I say this is my shelf to keep the conversation going.
Make sure that this works.
Yes, give me 1 second. Can you hear me? Yes. Great. Speaking of keeping the conversation going, the conversation that I'm going to keep going here is one between me and my students at the Oregon State Penitentiary, where I taught the novel Stalingrad last spring in a 10-week quarter with 12 incarcerated men and 12 students from the University of Oregon. And I had read Stalingrad before, and I was terrified to teach this class because I don't know if any of you have read it. It's a very long book, not an easy book, but those students, particularly the inmates, they loved it, and they gave me the confidence to just keep going with it. And so the passages I'm going to talk about here are those which, as I was reading it with them, I discovered because somehow it had to do with something that really struck me and that I wanted to share with them and that they shared with me. And I'm really terrified at the time when I'll ever have to write anything that doesn't emerge from a conversation, particularly in that context. And I was up at the penitentiary just a few nights ago engaging with some of these guys, so here we go. In his magisterial, we now know it's definitely magisterial, recent book, because Saul is a magister, a master, Wonder Confronts Certainty, Saul acknowledges Vasily Grossman's stature among the great Russian novelists. And he has illuminating things to say, not only about life and fate, but also about Stalingrad, the less well-known and only fairly recently translated into English prequel to Life and Fate. For Saul, it is wonder that prevails over ideological certainty in many of the great Russian novels. For Grossman, what prevails over ideological certainty are small and often unpredictable acts of kindness, what Professor Morson refers to as the prosaics, rather than the grand gestures that make up life's defining moment. I actually have not yet graduated to the brilliance of your PowerPoint. I have some passages here, old-fashioned, what do we used to call them? Handouts. Thank you very much. Yeah. So maternity and maternal feelings that erupt outside of political structures and institutions are central to Grossman's great dilogy and inflect the novelist's understanding of responsibility. I'll comment on 4 passages from Stalingrad that highlight the importance of maternity and its connection to responsibility for the other, and we'll conclude with some words about Grossman's encounter with Raphael's painting of the Sistine Madonna, which you see before you. Grossman dedicates Life and Fate to his mother, but she looms large over the first volume of the Dilogy as well. Inspired by her example, in chapters 60 to 61 of Part 1 of Stalingrad, the Dilogy's protagonist, the nuclear physicist Victor Strum, who is clearly a stand-in for Grossman himself, has an ethical epiphany in which he responds to the pressing moral demands of the moment. In the wake of the Nazi invasion, Victor, with his family, has fled from Moscow more than 500 miles east to the city of Kazan. Victor is married to Ludmila. Sorry to go over these relationships, but I hope you can follow it. There are 3 Shaposhnikov sisters. Victor is married to Ludmila, the oldest of these 3 sisters, and her first husband was the communist fanatic Abarchuk, of whose ilk Ludmila's mother once remarked, and this is passage number 1, which I think goes to our topic of Beyond Ideology, of Abarchuk, they just don't know how to reconcile love of humanity with love for an actual person. Victor is temporarily back in Moscow to attend some meetings. Before he returns to Kazan, he sets off by train to his dacha outside Moscow. Victor is at the moment absorbed by what Grossman calls the logic of selfish desire. While in Moscow, he's become infatuated by a young woman who's a neighbor with whom he desperately wants to start a physical affair. On this Sunday before the Nazi assault on Stalingrad, he opens his briefcase and finds a small package from Stalingrad that he had been given earlier that day, and that he now discovers contains a letter from his mother. It was, Grossman's writes, his mother's record of her last days, from the beginning of the war until the eve of her inevitable death behind the barbed wire of the Jewish ghetto. It was her farewell to her son. Now, the letter was forwarded from Ukraine by a man named Ivanikov, who received it directly from Victor's mother. The deeply compassionate and brave Ivanikov will, in life and fate, be named Ikonikov, the preacher of senseless kindness, who speaks that novel's essential truth. And because I was so engrossed in my teaching last spring, I wasn't able to make it here. So that's why, for last year's conference, so that's why I'm particularly grateful to be here today. And I spoke about Ikonikov a year ago. Deeply affected by his mother's letter, by her devotion to him, and by her example of selfless giving, Victor now finds himself faced with a powerful moral challenge. He receives a desperate telephone call in the darkness of early morning, just before 3:45 a.m., from a relative, Semyon Krimov, who needs Victor's help with a new electronic control system that was designed by Victor's laboratory. The relative's factory manufactures equipment that's crucial for the country's war effort. Krimov wants Victor to send one of his research assistants to Chelyabinsk, which is more than 1,000 miles due east of Moscow, and he tells Victor that the journey is going to be a very difficult one in a heavily loaded transport plane, not a passenger aircraft. The technical problem, Krimov says, is both complex and urgent. Only a scientist with a sound theoretical understanding would be able to help. Rather than send a telegram to his colleagues in Kazan, Victor, realizing that the mission is urgent, says, "I'll come myself. I'll see you this evening." A little more than an hour later, Victor leaves for Chelyabinsk. Inspired by his mother's example, Victor says, as it were, "Hineni, here I am," the phrase often uttered in the Bible by those who answered to the call of responsibility. And there is indeed something biblical, maybe Bob Alter will agree with me about this, about Victor's rising to this occasion, as if through that gesture of responsibility for the other, the earthly realm were connecting to the heavenly. And this is passage 2. The beam of a searchlight moved past in the dark. Victor watched it, wondering whether it would disappear into the blackness as suddenly as it had appeared. The beam trembled, darted to the right, then to the left, and then froze, a vertical pale blue pillar between the dark of the earth and the dark of the sky. Maternity for Grossman most often erupts outside of and in spite of political institutions. And we see this clearly in a passage in part 2 of the novel when Marusia, the middle daughter of the 3 Shaposhnikov sisters and a true believer in communist orthodoxy, visits an orphanage in Stalingrad. Marusia has heard reports that the director of the children's home was not sufficiently enforcing discipline in her staff. An example was a cleaning woman named Klava Sokolova, who would sing songs in an inebriated state and who had a lover who would come to visit her at night in the orphanage. This behavior from Marusia made it impossible to build a strong, healthy collective of the staff at the orphanage, than which, according to Marusia, nothing is more important. Marusia's emphasis is on the collective, But while Sokolova was allegedly not helping to build a strong, healthy collective, she was the only member of the staff who was able to comfort a traumatized little boy who, after the German air raid, discovered to his horror his loving parents lying dead side by side. Marussia decides that Sokolova must be dismissed, but she's given pause when she learns from the head of the orphanage that the staff member who Marussia is convinced needs to be dismissed is the very same woman who is the only person to whom the orphaned young boy will speak. Marussia, faced with this paradox of the coexistence within a single individual of extraordinary kindness and less than politically orthodox social behavior, passage 3 in your handout, was unable to hold back her tears. And she was muttering, Marussia, "It's so hard to understand. Why? Why is it so hard?" Maternity here has disrupted ideology, calling into question in the mind of this communist true believer the moral self-sufficiency of socialist political institutions. It was the witnessing of maternity that, immediately after the Nazi bombing of Stalingrad, brought the youngest of the three Shaposhnikov sisters, the beautiful and artistic Zhenya, back to a conscious awareness of what was happening around her. Everyone who saw Zhenya during the early hours of the Nazi assault thought that she had lost her mind. How could this tall young woman be walking along so slowly and deliberately with such a calm look in her eyes? And Grossman continues, this is the fourth passage. What brought Zhenya back, what allowed her to sense the horror of what was happening around her, was not the flames of burning houses or the dust and smoke swirling above them. What brought Zhenya back was the sight of an old, poorly dressed woman lying in the middle of the boulevard, her hair matted with blood. Kneeling beside her was a chubby-faced man in a smart raincoat, gray raincoat. Slipping his arms beneath the old woman and trying to lift her up, he was repeating, "Mama, Mama, what's happened? Mama, what's the matter with you? Mama, Mama, say something to me." The old woman reached out and gently stroked the man on the cheek, as if her wrinkled hand were the only thing in the world. Zhenya Zhenya saw at once everything it expressed. The mother's gentleness, her tears, her gratitude for her son's love, the plea of a being now helpless as a baby, her forgiveness of her son's failings, her desire to comfort her son, who was young and strong and yet unable to help her. Zhenya stretched out her hands to the cruel, snarling sky and yelled at the invading Nazi airplane pilots above, "What are you doing, you bastards? What are you doing?" What's valorized in this passage is maternity, of selfless giving to the other. The Russian man in the raincoat is lamenting the imminent death of his loving mother, who's reaching out and gently stroking her son on the cheek. The man's mother is dying, but she is not thinking of her own death. She's rather consumed with a desire to comfort her son, who is young and strong and yet unable to help her. Let's now turn to the response of another member of the Shaposhnikov family, Vera Spiridonova, the daughter of Marussia, to the initial and catastrophic bombing of Stalingrad by the Germans. Grossman's great dilogy is the Soviet and Jewish version of Tolstoy's War and Peace. I now would like to draw your attention to a passage in Stalingrad that appears to be modeled on a scene from War and Peace, in which the novel's chief protagonist, Pierre Bezukhov, rescues a little girl from a burning building after the invading French forces, led by Napoleon, entered and sacked Moscow. At great personal risk, Pierre, having been summoned by the little girl's desperate mother, enters the burning building, locates the child, and, with a feeling of pity, pressed the wet, painfully sobbing child to himself as tenderly as he could and ran with her out of the building. Vera becomes the compassionate, less than conventionally virile Pierre Bezukhov, of Grossman's Stalingrad, and this is passage 5. Vera went up into the burning building. When she got to the second floor, someone shouted, "Don't go any higher, you won't be able to find anyone still alive up there." She went on up the very same staircase she had run down in panic only an hour earlier. Then Vera groped her way, coughing and blinking, into a room where the ceiling had collapsed and that was now full of whirling, burning smoke. When a thin man who had fallen onto the floor stared into her eyes and reached out towards her, his hands almost as pale as the white smoke, she felt such overwhelming emotion that she wondered how there could be room for it in her heart. 2 of the 4 men left to die in this ward were still alive. She understood from the way these 2 men looked at her that they had been suffering something still grimmer than the agony of impending death. They had thought they had been abandoned. They had been hating and cursing the human race for forgetting those who must never be betrayed and forgotten, those whose mortal wounds have left them as weak and helpless as a newborn infant. Vera's heart filled with motherly love. She understood what her presence meant to these men. She began to drag one of them out of the ward. The other asked, "Will you come back?" "Of course," she said, and she did. One can't speak about maternity in Grossman's oeuvre without discussing, however briefly, his remarkable essay on his encounter with Raphael's painting of the Sistine Madonna, Dostoevsky's favorite painting, which the earlier novelist encountered in Dresden. The Soviet forces, after defeating Hitler at the cost of more than 20 million Soviet lives, removed some of the paintings from the Dresden Art Gallery and took them to Moscow. In the spring of 1955, the Soviet government decided to return them to Germany. Before the paintings were returned, they were exhibited in Moscow for 3 months. On the morning of May 30th, 1955, Grossman entered the Pushkin Museum, climbed the stairs to the first floor, and was stunned by Raphael's painting. In the center of the canvas, the Virgin Mary, holding her son, the Christ child, in her arms, strides from the heavenly towards the earthly realm. She is flanked by the 2 patron saints, Saint Sixtus and Santa Barbara, of the Benedictine San Sisto Church in Piacenza. The mother and child are clearly apprehensive. Saint Sixtus seems to be pointing toward a space outside of the canvas. Towards what or whom is he pointing? Placed behind a choir screen that no longer survives, the painting in its original setting would have faced a crucifix attached to the screen. The Virgin and her young son are thus likely gazing at a crucifix. Perhaps, Grossman asks, the mother and child, quote, can see Golgotha and the dusty, rocky road up the hill and the hideous, short, heavy, rough-hewn cross lying on a shoulder that is now only little and that now feels only the warmth of the maternal breast. But St. Sixtus is also, it appears, pointing at the viewer, at us. On his way back from the Pushkin Museum, Grossman says he realized that he had seen this Madonna and her child before, in the faces of the Jewish mothers and their children that he had witnessed at Treblinka just after the camp was liberated in 1944. Grossman imagines that during the time this young mother was raising her child, a painter by the name of Adolf Hitler stood before her in the Dresden Art Gallery while he was deciding her fate. But the ruler of Europe could not look her in the eye, nor could he meet the gaze of her son. Both she and her son, after all, were people, were human beings. Grossman then imagines Stalin looking at the Madonna in the Pushkin Gallery and questioning whether he, like Hitler, was capable, in the days when he was a powerful dictator, of being humbled by truly seeing the Madonna's vulnerable yet determined face. Towards the end of his remarks on the Sistine Madonna, Grossman comments on the suffering of the Soviet people during the Second World War and on the ditches that contain the bodies of murdered Jewish children and mothers. Why, he asks, has life been so terrible? Are you and I not to blame, vini? Perhaps Raphael's painting asks the same question. Perhaps St. Sixtus is pointing both at the crucifix in front of the painting and at the viewer, accusing the viewer, accusing me, accusing us of not doing more to prevent the great catastrophes like the Holocaust that result from our not responding or not responding quickly enough to the vulnerable faces of the Madonna, the epitome of maternal love in her young child, accusing us of not rising to the Madonna's example, of not being sufficiently maternal. Here, two great but very different masters of the Russian novel, Vasily Grossman and Fyodor Dostoevsky, meet in their shared conviction that, as Dostoevsky famously writes in The Brothers Karamazov, each of us, before everyone and for everything, is responsible, vinavat, but I more than all the others. Thanks.
Okay, could I have our panelists come up here? And we have about 10 minutes for questions. Running a little bit behind. We have about 10 minutes, though.
Oh, yeah.
And do we have a first question from the audience? Let's switch also to, do you still have your, I think this works. There you go. Use that.
The question for Bob Alter, is this working? Yeah. You spoke generally of comic novels, and I mean, I thought your talk was really good, and I have read Tristram Shandy relatively recently, so I particularly enjoyed your comments on that. And I thought the comments you made in general were quite good. But you spoke about comedy in general, and I think the three examples you gave are what we might call Aristophonic comedy, satirical comedy, but there's a whole other huge stream of comedy, romantic comedy, which it seems to me ends with a marriage, sort of celebrates the renewal of life, and sort of focuses. I mean, I say that the difference between tragedy and romantic comedy is the tragedy focuses on the individual and death is the end, but romantic comedy focuses on the community, and death is part of the process of life, and it's followed by renewal. So, you know, you don't have to go into all of that, but I wonder if you would agree that the comments you were making, the general comments, really apply to one important type of comedy, but not to comedy in general.
Oh yeah, I think, by the way, your concise statement about romantic comedy and the community is very apt, and I entirely agree with that. So yeah, there obviously are different types of comedy, and the type of comedy that's in some way or other satirical, which means it has a critical edge, is the one that I think is most relevant to the critique of ideology, of literature that Saul articulates. Thank you.
Any other questions? Oh, Michael.
Thank you. My question's for Stephen. First, quick comment. Wonder if you knew that Dostoevsky kept that painting with him, right? And it's interesting that you found a connection between mothers and suffering, which bears out in the brothers, right, where fathers are abusive, at least the main father is abusive and neglectful, and Zosima urges us towards the merciful mother of the church by contrast, right? But also I think his act of love is geared towards a kind of maternal strength, right? That's missing from the brittleness of paternal strength. And so what I wanted to ask was actually, do you think, unless I missed it, that Grossman didn't see the cherubs in his writing, or didn't write about them, and the pulling back of the veil as well, that is the curtains on either side? Those two things jump out at me in the painting and occasion a kind of discovery. I think that's important. So do you think there's a blind spot? Do you have a way of understanding how he might think of them?
Yeah. Oh, by the way, Dostoevsky had this, somebody made a photograph of this painting, and they had it, I think, in his study or in his living room. And also those cherubs at the bottom were cut out. Actually, didn't think, you know. So I think Grossman wasn't particularly interested in that. He wasn't interested in the otherworldly aspect of it. In fact, he said it was a totally atheistic painting, and I have my own way of understanding what he meant by that. So I don't know if I'm answering your question. I'm not sure. The idea of mothers in Dostoevsky or maternal love, that's a whole other issue. But I know that for Grossman, the idea of the mother and of maternal love, it just so struck me that, I mean, you know, that passage that I started off with, where what engenders his moral consciousness at that moment is learning about the death of his own mother and how much his mother has meant for him. So I'm not sure I want to extend it to Dostoevsky outside of the fact that certainly Dostoevsky understood the importance of compassion, of being able to respond to others, to be loving and caring, even though he wasn't always that way necessarily himself. So I'll leave it. I think I'll leave it at that.
Any other questions? We have time for one or two more. Yes, sir.
Steve, I want to offer a hypothesis about one of the quotations you have here. It's the one where, you know, the mother reaches out to her son, right? And of all that compassion, and then it goes on to a very jarring other note. What are you doing, you bastards? Okay, now, my hypothesis is that he had to add that last paragraph because in Soviet ethics, compassion was a vice, not just a right. Compassion is a vice in Soviet ethics. So he had to add, he couldn't end it with that. He had to add this completely jarring other passage. Maybe even a censor made him add it, but, or he, you know, knew in advance that he couldn't end on the compassion. He had to end on the curse.
Maybe I'm certainly worth thinking about, but it seems to me that that hearing, this is about Zhenya. I don't know, a kind of moral awakening for her. What brings her awake, she's just totally in a daze, is this notion of responsibility, which she and the mother's maternal love there. So I think that somehow evokes in her an anger at the Nazis for what they're doing, which is everything opposite from being compassionate. So I think it's a kind of her awakening. She's awakened by her moral conscience from the days, and you can imagine how traumatized one would be by this relentless and horrific sudden bombing of Stalingrad, and so that's what brought her back. But you know, who knows? I think that's a very interesting hypothesis. But to me, it still works without having to think of it as somehow responding to a potential censor. But you
but you remember the key, one of the key passages in the book is, I forget which character it is, who was told to take care of a wounded German soldier.
Yeah.
Thinks that take care of him. I ought to strangle him. But when he asks for water, she doesn't even know why, but she gives him water and takes care of him. And Grossman editorializes, this is the essence of the human, the senseless kindness.
Yes.
That's the opposite of, damn you bastard Germans.
Yeah.
I mean, it's
Yeah.
the very opposite. Right? And that's why it seems
Yeah.
like it doesn't fit to me,
Yeah,
right?
yeah. But the mother is expressing senseless kindness. I mean,
True.
in a
Okay,
sense.
well, maybe.
Yeah, but that's excellent suggestion. Thank you.
Donna would
I
like.
don't know the history of the censorship and what it had to do with the way this novel was put together, the first one in particular.
But I should add, and I think it's wonderful, Saul, that you brought up the senseless kindness piece. But there's also, Grossman is very, very concerned to show why the Soviets fought back, the Russians fought back so strongly. So this is the moment when we see the hatred that is born from the behavior of the Nazis. And that's, I think that...
Well, I think this isn't, excuse me, I didn't mean to interrupt you, but I don't think it's just a question of being true to the censors. I mean, Grossman preferred the title Stalingrad to what it was originally. Oh, okay. Oh, okay. Right.
People do the thing. Oh, why people do the things they do in war. And this is one of the great books on that subject, actually, and borrowing from War and Peace, of course.
Great. All right, let's give our participants a round of applause, and we'll conclude this session. We're about 15 minutes behind, but I think that's okay, pushing everything back 15 minutes. And we'll have a 30-minute break right now and reconvene at 3:45. So, good. The coffee is fresh over here.
So I'm just curious why is that bad? Ladies and gentlemen, is this on? Brad. Hello. Can you help me get something? Do you know how this works? We need everybody's attention here. It's not on. Is it?
Hello?
Oh, it is. It is. Okay. Brad, time to get going. It's time. It's time. Yeah.
Okay, we're going to have everyone come back to their seats and we're going to begin. No, we had Hello, hello. You want testing?
Testing 1, 2. Yes? All right.
Higher.
How's that? Good. All right, cats, you're about to be herded, so
What's up, everyone? Oops. Here we go. All right, we're going to begin our panel now, our final panel of this conference. And the papers that we'll be hearing from are our first scholar is Dr. Andrew Wachtel from Campus College of Art and Design in Bishkek, Kyrgyzstan. He will be presenting a paper entitled "Between Good and Evil: The Ethics of Dealing with the Devil." And Robin Fuller Miller from Brandeis University will be presenting a paper entitled "Sentences and Sensibility." And finally, Caryl Emerson of Princeton University will be presenting a paper entitled "Wonder Confronts Prosaics." So take it away.
okay, well, let's try to stay awake. I realize it's getting late in the day and everybody has been here for a long time, and I will try to not let you fall asleep. So as some of you know, I worked here at this lovely, wonderful university for 19 years with Saul in the same department, and we're both still alive, so apparently we got along reasonably well. And I used to joke that Saul could write a 200-page book about a 600-page novel, and I needed to write a 200-page book. I needed 50 novels. Because we work in very, very different ways and we think about the world very differently. And I think that, I mean, this morning Lindsay Sargent mentioned that it was good to talk to the two of us because we had very different ways of seeing. I think that's true, and it was good for working in tandem with Saul. So what I would say about Saul is that in the lovely terminology of Isaiah Berlin, Saul is a hedgehog. And I'm a fox. And I'm not saying one or the other is better than, but they just are what they are. And as you know about hedgehogs, they look very deeply at one thing, although the thing can change potentially over time. And foxes like to sort of run around on the surface and do things that way. But Saul is a hedgehog who appreciates foxiness, and I hope that I'm a fox that appreciates hedgehogness, and that's how we manage to work together. Now, in general, in the academic world, I think that hedgehogs predominate, and I don't really want to go into why they predominate, but I think they do. And I would say that I was lucky as an academic fox that I had two mentors who had my temperament. And one of them is here today, and that's my dissertation advisor, Boris Gasparov, and I want to thank him for being willing to work with me. So the other one was Yuri Streeter at Harvard. They were the two foxes I ever knew in the academic world of Slavic. Anyway, so today I'm going to think about how a fox uses a hedgehog to read a certain type of text, and the text is about dealing with the devil. Now, I should say that I'm no longer a professional literary person. I do other things these days, but I still read a lot, probably like 50 novels a year, something like that. And as I read, it's like an occupational hazard. You begin to see connections between things, and then you look for them, and then you try to do something with them. So in this particular instance, I was reading Haruki Murakami's novel 1Q84. I don't know how many people here might have read 1Q84. If you haven't read it, you should. It's an amazingly great novel. But I'll give you a kind of quick rundown. It's only 800 pages long. And it focuses on three main characters: a youngish writer who has written or ghost-written a novel about a religious cult, a youngish woman with whom he is in love, and she with him, but from whom they've been separated for 20 years without knowing each other and not knowing that they love each other exactly. And they're somehow searching for each other, however. And then the third character, who is the devil, basically. Although he's not really, I mean, it's in a Japanese context, so the devil isn't quite the same devil as the Western devil, but still, he's a devil. And I'm not going to waste the time with the plot summary, but essentially the female lead character is asked to perform a very difficult service for the devil, and including killing him in the end of that service. And in exchange for that, she is rewarded by being reunited with her lover, and the two escape to a world apart from the modern Japan in which they live. And the action takes place amidst a landscape characterized by two natural features, moons and thunderstorms. Now, as I was reading this novel, I said to myself, where have I seen this before? And I said, I've seen this before. This is The Master and Margarita. This is a rewrite of The Master and Margarita. My son, who is a specialist in Japanese literature, I sent this idea to, and he said, where did you decide that from? I don't know if that's true. I said, I don't care if it's true. It is true. So, I mean, anyway, it's true. So let's recall The Master and Margarita. Again, we have a novel in which we have a writer who has written about a religious cult, in this case, the Master. And he is separated from his love, Margarita, who, in order to be reunited with him, has to perform a service for the devil. And as a result of that service, she is rewarded by being brought back together with her lover, the Master. So I started thinking about these connections between making deals with the devil and how they come out. And then I thought, well, why do these deals with the devil come out more or less positively? Because in general, we kind of think that it's a bad idea to make a deal with the devil. I mean, after all, he's the devil. And then I started thinking about, well, why is it that it's a bad idea to make a deal with the devil? I mean, in literature, why is it a bad idea to make a deal with the devil? And so I began to think about why that might be true, not just because the devil is a bad guy, but what is it about making the deal with the devil that is so terrible? And so let's go to the videotape and think about earlier works in which deals with the devil take place and why they take place, or why they come out the way they come out. Now, the first kind of major literary work that we can talk about is Marlowe's tragedy of Dr. Faustus. And what strikes the reader of that work is the situation of Faust before he sells his soul to the devil. If you recall the play, which probably you don't, he's not a sort of second-rate person. He's a first-rate scholar. And he says, are there not bills hung up as monuments whereby whole cities have escaped the plague and 1,000 desperate maladies been eased as a result of his work? But the problem is that he wants more. And when he has conjured Mephistopheles, he sends the following message to Lucifer. Say he surrenders up to him his soul, so he will spare him 24 years, letting him live in all voluptuousness, having thee ever to attend on me, to give me whatsoever I shall ask, to tell me whatsoever I demand. So if we ask what sin Faustus has committed, the answer is intellectual laziness, right? It's not that he makes a deal with the devil and that that's automatically a bad thing. It's that he was a very hardworking guy, and now he wants to get everything the easy way, and the devil allows him to do that. Now, if we say that's what's sort of laziness is the unethical thing about dealing with the devil, now we can turn to my friend Saul. Well, I wasn't going to say that, but if you want, we can say that. But in his discussion of ethics and the novel, written together with Caryl, channeling Bakhtin, Saul situates novelistic ethics between absolutist theory and total relativism. And he said, or I quote, "In ethics, absolutism destroys the oughtness of an event by replacing it with rules. Relativists agree that ethics is a matter of rules, but deny that non-arbitrary rules can exist. Neither position is compatible with ethical action, as either Bakhtin or Tolstoy understood it." And continues, "If ethics were a matter of rules, and we could know these rules, all the work of an ethical action would disappear because we could simply and thoughtlessly apply them. Conversely, if anything goes, there is also no work. But if ethics is real and located fundamentally in particular situations, then real work is always required." Okay, so real work is always required. The laziness of making the deal with the devil is you get out of doing real work. And since you get out of doing real work, it is unethical by definition. And that's where your problem is. And we'll talk a little bit later about how this shows up in the contemporary world. But for now, let's take a look at Faust, Goethe's Faust. And we will see that it's the same problem, right? So Faust has studied hard and is well respected by his students and the general public, but he concludes that after a life of study, quotes, "All I see is that we cannot know." And so what he wants is more knowledge without the work. And then this is one of my favorite quotes in Faust. "Therefore I have turned to magic, so that by the spirit's might and main, I might yet learn some secret lore, that I need no longer sweat and toil, and dress my ignorance in empty words, that I might behold the warp and woof of the world's inmost fabric, of its essential strength and fount, and no longer dig about in words." So I don't have to waste my time doing all this terrible work. I can make a nice deal. And then Mephistopheles says to him, "My friend, in this 1 hour you will gain far more for all your senses than in a year's indifferent course." And then in an aside, Mephistopheles says to the reader, audience, "If you once scorn all science and all reason, the highest strength that dwells in man, and through trickery and magic arts, abet the spirit of dishonest, then I've got you unconditionally." Right? So that's the problem of dealing with the devil, is that the devil wants to give you things easily, doesn't want you to work, and by definition, if you don't work, it's not ethical. Now, what I noticed, however, is that as we move into more modern works of modernism and postmodernism, somehow this changes, and it becomes all right to deal with the devil, and sometimes maybe even positive. And the question is, well, how does this happen, and why does this happen? Now, in one of Saul's favorite works, in the Legend of the Grand Inquisitor, we will recall that the Inquisitor attacks Jesus for having refused to agree to a deal with the devil, right? So Jesus said he wouldn't make a deal. And the Grand Inquisitor says that in so doing, Jesus made things impossibly difficult for humankind, which would have been better off if they did not need to do the difficult work of making choices. Or as he puts it, "Говорю тебе, что нет у человека заботы мучительнее, как найти того, кому бы передать скорее тот дар свободы, с которым это несчастное существо рождается." So I tell you that there's no more terrible thing for a human being than to find someone to whom they can pass on this burden of freedom, this gift of freedom, with which this unhappy being is born. So, according to the Inquisitor, who in fact is the voice of the devil, what almost everyone secretly wants is to trade hard ethical work and responsibility for certainty and everyday comforts. Jesus, in this telling, becomes a kind of reverse Faust, who refuses to make a deal with the devil precisely because he values ethical striving and believes that everyone is capable of it. Now, if we look at these 21st century works, and the first one I want to look at is Thomas Mann's Dr. Faustus, we see something different happening. The devil whom Dr. Faustus meets in that novel is Ivan Karamazov's devil. It's the same devil, and it's the same scene rewritten by Mann. but it's now in this extremely difficult medieval High German that this chapter is written in, where he talks with the devil. But what happens is the devil makes a different deal with this Faust. The devil says to him that he says he's selling time, the same 24 years that Faust gets. He says, time, simple time. No, my dear friend, that is not the devil's ware. For that we should not earn the reward, namely that the end belongs to us. What manner of time? That is the heart of the matter. Great time, mad time, quite bedeviled time, in which the fun waxes fast and furious, with heaven-high leaping and springing. What happens is that Dr. Faustus in Mann's novel makes the deal because he wants to work. It's a totally different concept. So he wants those 24 years because he's going to work like a slave in order to become this great composer, the greatest composer who ever lived, which is his desire. But it's not the deal that Faust, the Goethe's Faust and Marlowe's Faust made, where they didn't want to work anymore. He wants to work, and he makes the deal, and he makes it completely knowingly that he's making this deal. And you can say it comes out well or not. I mean, according to the novel, this sort of very weird narrator of the novel, he does become this great composer of the world. Of course, we can't actually hear the music, so it's hard for us to know. But in principle, he gets what he wants, and then he dies miserably the same way that Faust does in the end and is dragged off to hell. But now maybe it's worth it, because at least he got what he wanted out of it. So if we go to Master and Margarita and we go to Murakami, then we see that there's an even more sort of a different evolution of this deal. Because in both of those novels, the main character who makes the deal with the devil doesn't actually search out a deal with the devil. It's quite the opposite. The devil searches out the character and makes a deal with the character. And in return, the character gets what the character wants. So it's not that someone makes a deal in order to get away with something. They actually perform some service for the devil, having some idea that they're going to get some reward. But in Master and Margarita, she very carefully refuses to ask for the reward until quite a while in, and he has to kind of force her to ask for her reward. So basically, the concept is that in the new version, 20th, 21st century of the Faust theme, then the character makes the deal with continuing to have the ethical possibility of doing work, and therefore they get away with it or even flourish. And now I want to quickly, so yesterday we had a talk by Misha Epstein about artificial intelligence, and I want to mention artificial intelligence here for a minute, precisely because I think that for a lot of our colleagues, the problem of artificial intelligence, particularly ChatGPT, is that they see it as a new version of the deal with the devil for their students, right? They think what students are going to do with it is use it to avoid doing all the work that we think students should be doing, right? And so that, by definition, is the same Faust version of like unethical behavior. Again, not because there's something inherently bad about AI, although maybe they think that too, but because it allows for this devilish deal that allows the student to avoid doing work. If we think about artificial intelligence differently, though, the way Misha Epstein was thinking about it yesterday, where you use it in order to extend the kind of work that you can do, then we won't think about it, I think, in quite the same way. So we have to decide, we as educators and people working in the world, can we make this kind of a deal with the devil? Can we make the 21st century deal with the devil, since the devil exists and is out there, such that our students actually have to work and we have to continue to work? Or are we going to just become these lazy people, who was discussed yesterday too, who are surfeited with information and stop thinking about anything and just look at their Instagram feeds all the time? So that's our choice, and we can decide, do we want to be pre-20th century dealers with the devil and end up in hell with no good recompense? Or do we want to be 21st century dealers with the devil and end up getting more or less what we want? Thank you.
So everyone can hear me? Yeah. Well, after so many, all right. Among so many towering intellectual achievements and a smorgasbord of talents, many of which we have already discussed in the last day and a half, Saul is a master of the evocative title, the boundaries of genre, hidden in plain view, the quotation and its genres, side shadows, the determination of free will, the words of others, sense and sensibility, wonder confronts certainty. And one of my very favorites, teaching as impersonation. And of course, Saul's own impersonations of literary characters, as we have already heard in his packed classrooms, are legendary at Northwestern and the envy of humanists everywhere. What is his magic? Titles are usually phrases or fragments of sentences, and my subject for today is Saul's sentences and sensibility. But his titles give a tantalizing hint of what lies ahead for the reader interested in both sentences and sensibility. Saul's readers are quickly drawn in. As for sensibility, before I come to that elusive notion, there is also, in strong contrast to sensibility, Saul's capacity, which we have already been talking about at length, his capacity to formulate theories, whether merely to enumerate three, it is boundary genres, side shadowing, or prosaics. These theories do what so many cannot. They hold water over time. They have entered the common discourse and, more significantly, not even polemically anymore. So where to start amidst his hefty pile of books, and I do have a handout for you, of books, hundreds, yes, I started to count and lost count after 100, of essays and reviews, chapters, and weighty and or mischievous, but always trenchant paragraphs. Let's turn to his sentences. Back in 2012, the novelist Jhumpa Lahiri wrote an op-ed for the New York Times, My Life's Sentences. She writes about how the sentences that she underlined as a student often did not coincide with what the professors were pointing out. Instead, she noted sentences, quote, for their clarity, their rhythm, their beauty, and their enchantment. For surely, she says, it is a magical thing for a handful of words to stop time, to affect us and alter us as profoundly as real people and things do. She writes about how certain sentences, quote, measured, unguarded, direct, and transcendent, all at once greet me as familiars, unquote. Yes, she does sound a bit like Tolstoy here, but she goes on to write about how her days, her entire life really, is composed of sentences. Well, I submit to you that Saul has written a number of such sentences. They tend to come in clusters, and they greet us as familiars in that striking, clear, and almost magical way. And that is what I will try to focus on today, to try, through his words, to glean the sensibility of that scholar, thinker, and theoretician we know, or think we know, so well. As to sensibility, it is a word we would do well to take more seriously than we currently do, for it denotes the ability to appreciate and respond to complex and aesthetic emotional influences. It is an awareness, a responsiveness, an ability to decide what is good or valuable, and it reflects a capacity to be influenced. Thus, it combines the emotional with the intellectual. In order to exist, it depends upon a kind of living open-endedness. You cannot have a dead sensibility. As an aside, Saul's and Morton Shapiro's Sense with a C and sensibility addresses sensibility head-on, though curiously, its index has no entry for sensibility, just as the index for wonder confronts certainty, despite its many, many entries for certainty, has no entry for wonder. As a lover of indexes, and as a past student of Rufus Mathewson, as a lover of indexes, which have been defined as a key to the erogenous zones of a text, I merely point this out. Before plunging directly into some of Saul's sentences, first let me make an analogy. There are some readers of Tolstoy who gravitate toward his piercing depictions of the living body, and dead body too, whether human or animal. Others who are most compelled by his philosophical, autobiographical, and spiritual writing. Still others who gravitate toward his representations of history and causality. Even if we respond forcefully to all three, each of us in our heart of hearts, like Dickens with David Copperfield, most likely has a favorite Tolstoy. And so it goes with Saul. There are his crystalline theoretical writings, his lapidary aphoristic statements, and those clusters of sentences which reflect an active, open sensibility on the move, one ready to make fruitful and free associations. Do you have a favorite among these modes of active response? I will thus focus upon the particular kind of sentence that I especially value, even cherish in Saul's vast oeuvre. Today I will, quote, dilate upon, to quote Mary Shelley's introduction to Frankenstein, not Saul's marvelous aphorisms, not his trenchant, sharp theoretical statements and demonstrations, but on those sentences which have magic, which greet us as familiar, which have rhythm, clarity, even beauty. There is an I Ching of Saul. You can play a game with his books, open a page at random, and plunk down your finger, and you will find either theory, aphoristic statement, polemic, or, if you are lucky, a cluster of beautiful, insightful, almost throwaway sentences on the run. Saul has a weighty, unified message to impress upon us. Or does he? Is he a confident hedgehog? Is he a contented fox? Is he a fox who longs to be a hedgehog like Isaiah Berlin's Tolstoy? Or perhaps a hedgehog who wants to be a fox? I had originally thought to talk today about Saul's engagement with Isaiah Berlin from early on in his career until the present. But more fun right now is to think about Saul himself as either a hedgehog or a fox or some gasp actual hybrid of the two, since he is fair game for us today. Saul, in hedgehog fashion, is not afraid to embrace big concepts, wisdom, free will, etc. His wit and acerbity tend foxily naturally to the aphorism, absolutist in form, a bit showy, but generally carefully limited in scope. Also fox-like are his more recently increasingly intensified preoccupations with pluralism, open-ended conversation as opposed to dialogue, and a genuine cosmic polyphony that keeps humming and buzzing without a final resolution. More on that at the end of my remarks. With all Saul's erudition and theoretical prowess, however, it is certain random sentences of his that have made an indelible imprint on me. Like Tolstoy, describing Helene's arm, Lisa's downy upper lip, Karenin's knuckle cracking, the very things that Turgenev and others have pointed out as failings, mainly because they were so jealous, have an equivalent in Saul's work. Not exactly an equivalent, but more of a loose comparison. For Saul is not so much an observer of the body, but rather of the text, about the text as a body of words. Saul has written hundreds of thousands of sentences, and I've chosen 6 short examples for us to consider. But I hope you like the photograph I took of his books. These sentence sensibility eureka moments come in little clusters. So, number 1, the extraordinary arrogance of Gulliver to his readers, like that of utopias from Plato to Skinner toward the benighted citizens they would instruct, reaches a paroxysm of vanity in Gulliver's concluding lines. I must freely confess, writes this ancestor of Shigalyoff, that since my last return, some corruptions of my Yahoo nature have revived in me by conversing with a few of your species, else I should never have attempted so absurd a project as that of reforming the Yahoo race. But I have now done with all such visionary schemes forever. This cluster of sentences is about genre, and offers an insight about the arrogance of utopia, a provocative equating of Plato with B.F. Skinner, and an unexpected, even breezy, but rich throwaway comment about Shigalov, a character in Dostoevsky's Demons, as a descendant of Gulliver, all of which are worthy of further thought and strongly invite a response from the reader. But Saul moves quickly on. The second example. History is a fabric of lost threads, and so is much of War and Peace. One particularly telling example occurs after the evacuation of Moscow, when a distant relative of the Rostovs arrives at their house asking for help. We overhear his musings, observe the activities of the servants, and witness the maternal feelings of one of them. This chapter occupies 3 pages, but its characters never reappear in the book. The incident appears to have no effect whatsoever on the work's overall plot, nor does it touch the lives of the main characters who never even learn of the incident. This cluster features a general statement about history and a plot that moves quickly into particularity. Saul's example, in fact, transcends the truism about history being a fabric of lost threads and makes thinking about history strange, new, and compelling again. I always use this example when teaching War and Peace, but then I have to confess I have trouble finding another equally useful and curious lost thread, except in crowds or on the battlefield. So after hunting for them, I always fall back on Saul's example. Maybe the little girls with plums, whom Prince Andrew sees at a moment of moral nausea, are lost threads, but they function so clearly as a metaphor for Andrew's moral nausea that they don't quite count. Nor, unlike the mysterious Rostov, do they have any interiority. Nevertheless, Saul's example of the dangling incident is so powerful and has become for me one of the hidden buttresses of War and Peace. The third example, Raskolnikov. I love this one. He does not plan but dreams of planning. He does not make meticulous preparations but argues abstractly that they could be made. Remote from the here and now, he never seems to know what time it is, and at the end of part 1 is even late, keeping his engagement for murder. Indeed, even the murder itself is undertaken as if it were just another rehearsal, unquote. At this moment in Saul's book, I read with the same kind of feverish intensity and dread with which I read part 1 of Crime and Punishment. Yet this passage also constitutes trenchant literary criticism. How often does one actually read literary criticism with that kind of avidity, with a feeling of dread and unwanted recognition? Here, Saul's analysis moves away from large questions of genre, history, and plot to render an unexpected statement about Raskolnikov's character in terms of his inability to orient himself to the real world and everyday time. Moreover, it is both open-ended yet specific, and ultimately profound. Even at the end of the novel, Raskolnikov is still dreaming about the other shore, about what is to come, but unlike Dostoevsky's dreamer in White Nights, he is not the artist of his own life or his own plot. He is a somnambulist who is rarely fully awake. Number 4, on teaching. Saul, that great teacher whom we would all like to emulate, tells us that the experience of reading a long, realist novel can change students, not because of our great teaching. No, it's, quote, because the student has so lived in the work that he or she has acquired a new set of eyes. From monocular, the student has gone to binocular vision. And now the world is a different place. By the end of a class, the students need no persuasion to realize that in a realist novel, the truth of a moment is not just what happens, but is a combination of A's perspective, B's perspective, C's perspective, A's on B's, B's on A's, and A's perspective on C, and the narrator on all of these. Saul is giving us, students, readers, teachers alike, that delicious permission to inhabit the novels we read, not like Woody Allen in Woody Allen's character in the Kugelmass episode, where a graduate student manages to build a machine that allows him to briefly but literally inhabit Madame Bovary, and even to appear to other readers as a previously unnoticed minor character. Would Saul be chatting with Pierre at Borodino? Would Caryl encounter Dolly on her carriage ride to Anna's country house? Would Donna, where's Donna, invite Haji Murat to join her and Prince Andrew to converse about the meaning of heroism? Would Bill ask Mushkin about his passion for calligraphy? Would Susan try to comfort Nellie and join her in her conversation with Ivan Petrovich about poor folk? On the practice of our discipline, number 5, the humanities, quote, properly taught, the humanities offer an escape from the prison house of self and the limitations of time and place. We live on an island in a vast sea of cultures, past and present. The humanities allow us to escape that island and return to it enriched with the wisdom of elsewhere. When we inhabit those works of literature, we escape the prison of ourselves and return with the wisdom of elsewhere. That is actually a deeply poetic phrase, the wisdom of elsewhere. It denotes an instinctive trust in what the other distant others, as Martha Nussbaum might describe them, have to give us and we them. Throughout Saul's variegated canon, certain preoccupations appear, disappear, appear again and again, modulate, develop, evolve. But there are constants too. Always the search for dialogue, whether it is the reader's dialogue with the character or the author's with his changed self, or a more polyphonic exchange, the large, noisy, often unruly conversation among groups of writers and philosophers, as Yuri has given us the dead ones, and increasingly our dead friends and comrades, from different times and places, with Saul's presence amidst them all, and beckoning us, like Zosima with the shy Alyosha at Cana of Galilee, if I may be so flowery, to join the group. Saul's hunger for debate, even for argument, has resulted surprisingly in something truly unusual, especially in our field, genuine collaboration. Witness his books, co-authored seamlessly, it looks like, with Caryl, with Morton Shapiro, where what was undoubtedly lengthy dialogue and often heated debate and disagreement transformed themselves for the reader into a single narrative, a single narrative. There is also Saul's own layered voice, humorously represented in his fictional co-authors and editors, Alicia Chudo and Andrew Sobosyednikov. Saul has inhabited the worlds of Tolstoy, Dostoevsky, Chekhov, Bakhtin, Isaiah Berlin, Martha Nussbaum, and so many philosophers, writers, critics, and intellectual friends whom we've been hearing about through all of this wonderful symposium, too numerous to re-enumerate. So back to Berlin's hedgehog and fox, which is Saul? Have most of us, I know Andrew and I have, I'm sure others have asked this question about Saul and about ourselves. I often ask my students, are you a hedgehog or a fox? And it sometimes precipitates quite a little crisis of identity. As Saul's own thinking, writing, and teaching have evolved, it seems to me, as one of his old acquaintances, our correspondence initially in letter form goes back to 1975. Yeah, that he was initially a proud hedgehog who has, through deep and voracious reading, through intellectual collaboration, through deep love of his growing and blended family, through dialogue, that Saul has embraced first as a principle and now as a genuine practice, the multitudinous, ever-adaptive attainments of a fox. Finally, in his recent book, Saul writes, In Wonder Confronts Certainty, Saul writes, we've all looked at this already, given human difference and the plurality of viewpoints, wisdom consists in learning to see the world from the perspective of others. By intellectual as well as emotional empathy, we can bring discrete positions into open-ended dialogue. When we do, we enrich both ourselves and the world. Gulliver's journey to elsewhere brought him disillusionment with humanity. Saul's hermeneutic journeys back and forth from the prison house of self to the wisdom of elsewhere have increasingly brought him a kind of harmony, a coming together of intellectual and emotional empathy. Dialogue, debate, and polemic for Saul have modulated into becoming voices of a general chorus, into recognizing something even more dialogic than dialogue, conversation. And I was thinking, and I wish I had it with me, about Tolstoy's both very early but also very late, because he finished it, it was a posthumous publication, A History of Yesterday. And there is a wonderful little part where the narrator who's trying to write a history of yesterday describes conversation as being like trying to roll an egg. And you never know how that egg is going to roll. You can't predict. I mean, mathematicians can't predict how the egg is going to roll. And that, to me, is what is so exciting about conversation. Like, if we have a dialogue, we're having a dialogue. If we have a conversation, who knows who's going to pop in some egg that's going to go somewhere. So conversation. How fitting, and we've already heard so eloquently and unforgettably about this, that wonder confronts certainty ends with let us keep the conversation going. Although, in the spirit of conversation, and as Saul's old friend, I might quibble with the penultimate sentence of the book, which begins, rightly conducted, the conversation, etc., about timeless questions remains engaging and endless. Rightly conducted, I don't know about rightly conducted. A whiff of the hedgehog in the garden, perhaps chatting with the fox. In conclusion, Saul's prose has evolved from one of occasional theoretical density to what is now a trademark clarity. It is bold, often provocative, but always embraces a dialogic ideal. It is presumptuous to generalize about the work of a critic, a thinker, who by my estimate has published well over 5,000 pages of critical writing. My hope, nevertheless, is that these sentence clusters demonstrate a sensibility where Saul is, at nearly every moment, engaged with various aspects of himself, as well as with the words and implied meanings of myriad others. Saul's work is fractal. Its minute parts replicate and predict its gigantic whole. Pascal tells us that the heart has reasons reason knows nothing of, but Saul's passionate engagement with big ideas shows us how reason has sensibilities that the heart may know nothing of. So, thank you, Saul. Oh, yeah. Oh, books.
The title of this talk is built off of a bad piece of wordplay. Donna Orwin and Sandy Goldberg opened the conference on Saul's book, Wonder Confronts Certainty, and now I seize the chance to close it on a concept that is far more familiar to me than certainty, namely prosaics. It's had a lot of attention, so this will be a recap and a summary. I was present at its theoretical birth, or rather its grounding, in the late 1980s in connection with Mikhail Bakhtin. This was after Saul had himself launched the word in 1987 in his book on Tolstoy's War and Peace. The concept has shape-shifted over the past 40 years, but it has stuck, appearing in the 2023 book as the subtitle of Chapter 10, Prosaics Hidden in Plain View. We might say that prosaics has become for Saul a cardinal virtue, akin to justice, fortitude, temperance, and prudence. Most of my talk today will be tracing, if only in bits, its backstory, especially as relevant to the goals of our Northwestern Initiative. Now, those words make up a lot of bits, but since the idea accretes, and there's a certain amount of imperial creep to prosaics, it will move pretty fast. Along the way, I'd like to take up another concept, which is wonder. This is more of a problem. Prosaics has a recognizable set of attributes, a distribution and a definition. But every person finds something else wondrous. God, inspiration, the beauties of nature, being in love, sex, power, military victory. Wonder is morally quite blank, which prosaics is not. So there's some conceptual tension, I think, in my title, some possibility of confrontation. So let's begin there. Prosaics is both a theory of 19th century realist prose and a theory of the non-heroic, a moral code that celebrates small-scale, step-by-step, mundane and pragmatic kindnesses, kindnesses that build a community as well as knowledge from the bottom up. Wonder, on the other hand, suggests, at least to many people, a top-down glimpse of the sublime, big scale, instantaneous, all at once, triggered by what is out of the ordinary, discontinuous, maybe even an antinomy. There is, to be sure, some overlap, as in this Venn diagram. Both sides share a trust in contingency, however, a suspicion of mechanical laws, at least when applied to human behavior, and finally a definition of reality as what hits you in the present, not in theory, but right now. And finally, both prosaics and wonder foster that most difficult virtue for ambitious, disciplined, successful people, and that is humility. So 1990, Saul and I identified prosaics as one of Bakhtin's 3 global concepts, together with unfinalizability and dialogue. The latter 2 belong to Bakhtin, but prosaics was Saul's neologism for what isn't lyric, drama, or epic, that is, for what doesn't fit into a classical poetics. Novelistic prose is a literary form in its own right, and more than merely fallen poetry or promoted rhetoric. Now, since Bakhtin loved novels and thirsted to make a theory out of them, it was easy at the time, and I think it was correct, to foist this term on him. But even back then, prosaics was more than literary. It was also a philosophy of the ordinary. This linking of the ordinary with the ethical is what the great 19th century realist novel did best. And Saul has long argued, no one does this more urgently than Leo Tolstoy. Now, Bakhtin wrote a fine book on Dostoevsky in 1929, revised it in 1963, in which he used Tolstoy largely as a negative example, the prototype of a monologic voice and a finalized, universalizing worldview. Now, that's true, but it didn't cripple the prosaics thesis too much. In his Dostoevsky book, Bakhtin was interested in the behavior of words, far more than in human actions or plots. And Bakhtin, it must be said, was always more of a trickster than a moralist. In any event, by the mid-1990s, Saul had begun to detach prosaics from literary form. But an aura of Bakhtin continued to cling to the idea. In 1994 came Narrative and Freedom, The Shadows of Time, with its chapter 3 titled Interlude, Bakhtin's Indeterminism. It was wedged in between the book's big ideas, foreshadowing, backshadowing, and side-shadowing. In this new context, Bakhtin's philosophy is read, and I quote, as a series of meditations in which aesthetic, ethical, and theological issues are intricately bound together. Now that theological is something of a jolt. It will be several years before theology in Bakhtin gains any traction in the West, and even then through excellent books that were written from within a religious tradition, first Eastern Orthodoxy, then Protestant Christianity, and finally Roman Catholicism. In 1994, Saul does a radical thing. He engages theology not through divine grace or the Trinitarian utterance, all that's been done later, but in more secular fashion and along one dimension only. Does a given narrative dare to open up time? Saul opens on William James' 1884 essay, The Dilemma of Determinism, on one of its thought experiments in which, and I quote James, God the Creator is made subject to the law of time. Now, God as an entity subject to time will receive quite a fascinating expansion in 2013. Theography, dialogical theology, process theology, open theism. Back in 2007, the approach was through William James. If you subject God to time, he suggested, the result would be, now this is Saul, that the creator, and that's any creator, small c, the creator would become genuinely limited, unable to see the pattern of the whole picture, and thus more akin to the prosaic. That is, the creator would no longer be a poet who can contemplate in an instant the pattern of a poem. Echoing Bakhtin here, Saul suggests that poetic rhythm imposes too many constraints on time. We live, or we should try to live, like those characters in Dostoevsky who act into an open future. Novels, Saul says, are not only good personal therapy, but also superior forms of thought. Now, it should be no surprise that there was some pushback brewing from inside the literary community, especially from those who loved the rigorous patterns of poetry and appreciated the reliability of semiotic codes. A forum was published in Slavic and East European Journal in spring 1997 under the title, The Limits of Prosaics. The questions were tough. Is it really true that form is dead in the lyric and the epic and alive only in novels? That's from me. Who says that lyric poems can't be ordinary or dialogic? That's Claire Cavanaugh. And what about a poet of genius like Pushkin, who defined himself through his creative struggle with social codes and poetic constraints, not by rejecting them, but by devising codes that were more subtle and constraints that were more demanding? In an afterword titled Prosaics Evolving, Saul responded enthusiastically to the criticism with a mix of confidence, good humor, and modesty. He granted that every theory has its weaker sides, that he himself was never sure whether the idea would lead him to a good place or a bad place, that he didn't approve of the extremist prosaics that Tolstoy insists on, when refusing to admit the importance of great men and great events. And also, Saul said, I love poetry, and Bakhtin did too. And I remember at the time asking myself, who's leading here, the thinker or the thought? Prosaic wisdom was becoming so organic to Saul, so consistent and unfalsifiable, that it can't be refuted any longer or knocked off balance. It just gets bigger and more accommodating. It practically grows itself. So now we're up to 2007. I confess that only last month did I read this book all the way through and carefully. In the 1980s, Saul and I had argued in print over Anna Karenina. Neither of us had much sympathy for the tragic heroine Anna, although for different reasons. And I didn't think there'd be anything new. Big mistake. By 2007, Anna herself had become almost an afterthought. Even though Tolstoy's great novel, with its histrionic, melodramatic, non-prosaic, and self-destructing heroine, could help us to see more wisely. Prosaics was now a freestanding moral system with a history and a mission. One that explained what had gone wrong with 17th century rationalism, what is incoherent about so-called social science and mechanistic theories of mind, and what we should make of theories and disciplines that attempt awkwardly to become surrogates for God. This to me was very exciting. I sensed in the Anna book that Saul was repositioning his own voice, launching a philosophical offensive for the humanities. The priorities were no longer only those of a strong literary critic, that is, bold, close readings of the devices that fiction writers use, even though they might be hidden in plain view. Now we're at the level of mega ideas, idea systems, and whole epics. This was more than a shift in methodology. It had become a mission of sorts, a mindset, and not without its risks. For example, Saul wrote that he hoped to create a dialogue between Tolstoy's ideas and some of our own, a dialogue that will optimally yield new insights present neither to Tolstoy nor to us. This will contribute, Saul wrote, to Tolstoy becoming Tolstoy. Now, such a route to becoming one's self more, through a dialogic relation with generations of later readers and listeners that were undreamt of by the original author, is, by the way, one of Bakhtin's big ideas which he uttered concerning Shakespeare. The words of all great writers, Bakhtin said, contain more wisdom than can be accessed in their own time. That's just the nature of language. And later generations are called on to liberate them from captivity to their own epoch. Bakhtin has been much criticized for this result of a remark that seemed to give too much license to creative critics and far too much leeway away from and perhaps in contrast to authorial intent. But Saul was convinced that with careful habits of reading, such dialogues could be responsible. And then follow his provocative ideas about Anna Karenina, the novel, which have stood the test of time. They appear in his most recent book, and they've been amply discussed at this conference as well. That Dolly, the long-suffering wife and mother, is prosaic good. That Stiva Oblonsky, Anna's brother, is prosaic evil, not active or ugly evil. Of course not. He's a charming and well-meaning fellow, but a person who doesn't care about the right things with a tremendously effective forgettery. That Anna herself is morally a mess, not only emotionally a mess, because of her non-prosaic habits. That Konstantin Levin is Tolstoy's pet and alter ego, yes, of course, but let's let that go. He is prosaic wisdom head to toe, because he knows that one must work at happiness which will never be complete. Saul ends his Anna book on 163 Tolstoyan conclusions, a veritable encyclopedia of prosaics condensed to aphorisms. Now, these are not Tolstoy's conclusions in any footnoted self. They are merely Tolstoyan, that is, Tolstoy-like. Many of them are pure Saul. And the last 2 dozen belong to the man who made Tolstoy his anti-hero, namely Mikhail Bakhtin. There's some playful self-irony in this list, of course, but surely we are meant to take its wisdom seriously. Some items can be mapped onto my Venn diagram a while back that juxtaposed aspects of prosaics and wonder. Here we see Anna Karenina. Here we see these 163 Tolstoyan conclusions. They're messy, small-scale, bottom-up, continuous, and ordinary. That becomes life experience, or at least the best we can hope for from most of our lives' experience. And the right side, big scale, clean, top-down, discontinuous, extraordinary, that has now become theory and utopia. In these Tolstoyan conclusions, there's an earnest attempt to bring the two sides together, such as in conclusion 7. Even extraordinary moments are largely the product of what happens at ordinary ones. Or conclusion 56, there exists a prosaic sublime. The voice that wrote these conclusions has now become authoritative and urgently pastoral, very much in Tolstoy's declarative style, and I think Saul sensed this. Among those who blurbed the Anna Karenina volume, Frederick Cruz also sensed this tone, and Frederick Cruz wrote, "This remarkable book amounts to a thoroughgoing challenge to the entire tenor and purport of Anglophone criticism from the 1970s until now. And it should be said that Saul, in his boldness and firmness in the face of what he felt to be intellectual folly, deeply resembles Cruz, as he does Robert Alter and that other UC Berkeley presence, Michael Andre Bernstein, whose tribute we've heard so movingly today, and whose own book, Foregone Conclusions Against Apocalyptic History, reflects their shared commitment to creative time. This thoroughgoing challenge goes even further in the next book, 2013, commissioned as a collection of already published things, but in characteristic Morson fashion. Almost everything in it is refitted, expanded, thought over again, shifted around, and yet it all recognizably belongs to the same terrain. Its title, Prosaics and Other Provocations, Empathy, Open Time, and the Novel. To dissect a bit that subtitle, empathy is what results from reading novels correctly. Open time, at any given moment, is the freedom we feel when possibilities are more abundant than actualities. Now, these are unalloyed good things. But part 3 of the book also consecrates a new voice, just as Saul had somewhat stylized himself into Tolstoy in parts of the Anna book. So here he outsources himself to a pseudonym that he's used on and off since the 1990s, Alicia Chudo, Alice the Wonder or Miracle. She contributes a huge chunk of text on the field of misanthropology, the study of human evil, concluding with a parody of Pushkin's Eugene Onegin, more of a translation actually into a new format and intellectual tone. This Alice the Wonder, or Alice in Wonderland, is dark, clever, hilariously funny, and one has to ask when a writer of Saul's stature chooses a pseudonym, why the pseudonym? The easy answer, at least to me, is that prosaics needs a lot of play. We heard this from Emily, his daughter, the other day. a lot of play. Any academic who mounts a relentlessly thoroughgoing challenge to academic culture, as Cruz and Alter and Bernstein and Saul know they are doing, that writer is bound to be a bit grim, or at least not sufficiently contingent. But also, I think, Alicia the Wonder confronts Prosaics in a way that licenses her to say wondrous things that Saul might want others to hear, but is not quite yet ready to say in his own voice. So she's a double, sort of. Saul has written provocatively on Dostoevsky's novella, The Double, Me and My Double in 2015, and in 2016, What Is It Like to Be Bats? Paradoxes of the Double. Fortunately, Alicia Chudo is not wholly her own person. She does not make the world more sensible, sane, or prosaic, but she does make it softer and funnier. She's a soul shadow for Saul, rather than a time shadow. Now, before leaving this book, a few words on Part 2, Chapter 3, The Prosaics of Process, because of its relevance to all three prongs of our initiative: philosophy, literature, and religious thought. To me, this chapter again felt like something of a quantum leap in Saul's thought, not just how to behave or how to read fiction, but a whole cosmology. And it's not only the overt theological questions that are raised about natural theology, compatibilism, about social scientists taking over the God function and being congratulated for it, even envied by humanists, about G.K. Chesterton's detective Father Brown and the idea that biblical wisdom might matter more than the materialist trace of a crime. Saul now endorses a larger cosmic binary, one with ancient roots, a binary between products and processes. On the one side, we have the old poetics, essence, static, fixed things, closed, predetermined, literary structure. On the other side, we have processes, the new prosaics, energies, flow, open, potential, side shadowing. And underneath it all, the utopian expectation of instant optimality. That's not a good thing. And on the other side, the prosaic processes side, a willingness to work incrementally with mess. The processorial's pragmatic side of this binary was hinted at in an appreciative blurb of the book by Michael Holquist, who had been both Saul's teacher and mine. Morson's provocations elevate sheer common sense to the level of non-absolutist metaphysics. Now, that's a provocative statement, and intuitively it's right on, but it's insufficient, I think. And that's because the problem with common sense is the same problem with wonder that we noticed earlier. Common sense is, in fact, not common. It's not held in common. It's highly individualized. It's unlike breathing or eating. And that's because it means something different to each person. So more to the point than common sense, I think, is a line from a review of Wonder Confronts Certainty, and now we're finally there, in 2024 by Rowan Williams in the journal First Things. Morson's book, Williams wrote, lays out the diverse responses we make when we are confronted with difference, disagreement, disharmony. We can respond with the wonder that accepts limitation, or the hunger for a world in which we are never out of control, never at a loss, never discovering, retelling, or rethinking. The implication here is that process, by definition, is wondrous because it accepts limits. Nothing is certain, even for a moment, without our constant work and input into it. In the decade between the Provocations book in 2013 and Wonder Confronts Certainty last year, the world studied by Russianists took a very bad turn. the seizure of Crimea, the aggressive union of Russian church with Russian state, the criminalization of dissent, the cult of Putin, and the full-scale invasion of Ukraine in 2022. It was time for Saul's prosaic metaphysics to strengthen its political side, and primarily, that case which had been in place for a quarter century, but gets a stronger emphasis in the most recent book, the case against the impersonalism and maximalism of the Russian intelligentsia. In this most recent book, Prosaics appears as chapter 10, What Don't We Appreciate? Prosaics Hidden in Plain View. Consider the devices and paradoxes that structure chapters 6 through 11 of part 3, Timeless Questions. The rhetorical device is to pit wonder against the certainties of the Russian intelligentsia, and its method, Saul's method here, is wholly apophatic. What can't theory account for? What is not to be done? Who is not to blame? What time isn't it? What don't we appreciate? What doesn't it all mean? Now, this is a clever device because we're not told what is good and knowable, only what is not. And we need only recall what the most dogmatic members of the Russian intelligentsia considered thoroughly knowable and for certain to see where that certainty took us. Much of what happens in the world doesn't have an answer to these questions, much less a predictive force, and sometimes we cannot find a cause at all. Now, for me personally, this modesty or cognitive humility has always been the most precious aspect of prosaics. It belongs to that side of prosaics that is turned toward wonder. We see it in Mikhail Bakhtin most famously in his discussion of great time from the 1960s. Bakhtin writes, "We fuss about in the narrow space of small time with its trivial attitude toward the future, desire, hope, fear. There is no understanding of evaluative non-predetermination, unexpectedness, surprisingness, absolute innovation, miracle, and so forth." Saul Pure, Saul Morson. Decades earlier, Bakhtin had jotted down a similar idea in a tattered notebook during the darkest years of the Second World War, 1943. Again, it sounds like pure Morsonian prosaics. A new philosophical wonder before everything is necessary. Everything could have been different. But here is the paradox. There is another side of prosaics, which appears as a subsection in chapter 10 of Wonder Confronts Certainty. And this subsection reads, "Prosaics resists sudden transformation. Value comes about through patient and plodding work," Saul insists, "not through windfalls, risk-taking, gambles, denials, or wishful sinking." How is this resistance to sudden transformation compatible, if it is, with unexpectedness, philosophical wonder, conversion or threshold experiences, Bakhtin's miracle? Now, I have no problem at all with Saul's insistence in his comments in this chapter on Alyosha Karamazov that, quote, "it is the small acts of goodness that are truly miraculous." Yes, of course, but that's too easy a way out of the really inexplicable miracle or the event of faith. Saul is forever coming close to this boundary and backing off from it. In a wonderful essay in the venue Plough for December 2022 on the topic of Tolstoy's narratives of faith, Saul discusses the famous stories and scenes, Prince Andrei's dying, the death of Ivan Ilyich, Master and Man, God sees the truth but waits. And if you know these famous Tolstoyan narratives, The great thing, at least for Tolstoy, is that the person is called to a conversion experience and then dies. He escapes his bad story, so he escapes all further duties. No more need to think about others. Those difficult interpersonal prosaic virtues no longer require all that work. But in one section of that essay, titled Beyond Justice, Saul gets to the core of the boundary that bothers me. When discussing God sees the truth, but waits. Waits for what? Justice? No. As Saul concludes in Tolstoy's name, justice is not necessary for the meaningful life. And at that point, I want to ask, where then is the ground of meaning for the prosaic life? Not the ground of meaning for one's bodily death, all those easy deaths like Ivan Ilyich, who is converted and then disappears, but the ground of meaning for the life. And this leads for my parting question, and this is where I'll end. What is the status of the transcendent? In an optimally prosaic novel, what is the absolute for a living person? What I'm after, of course, is the nature of religious or metaphysical wonder, religious commitment, irreversible conversion, so securely lodged in the transcendent that it resists all further mundane prosaic tests. After all, divine revelation, in many people's experience, is also an experience. Is it true, as Denis Chernyakleev said yesterday, that Saul's moment-to-moment ethics, his small ethics, step-by-step life ethics, doesn't need a totality or a vision of wholeness? Plenty of characters that Saul loves have this. Sonia Marmeladov in Crime and Punishment, Princess Mardia in War and Peace, Alyosha Karamazov, perhaps even Mary Garth in Middlemarch. These characters are fully coherent. Their feet are on the ground, they do loving things all the time, but they remain opaque even to their authors because they believe in something that cannot be documented in any prosaic way. The wonder of the transcendent does not have to depend upon divine conferral, of course. It is simply something or somewhere that is not contingent, not transient, and not dependent upon a prosaics of process. Can the transcendent, or the absolute, in other words, be reconciled with Saul's Tolstoyan conclusion number 107? Beware of belief systems that can be adopted whole. It's my sense that Tolstoy himself, although a great seeker, would have rejected that conclusion, at least during the final decades of his life. So why I adored reading 35 Years of Saul on Prosaics for this presentation. During that experience, I've thought a great deal about the relation of this thesis and his life's devotion to its elaboration and expansion to this problem of whole belief systems. I was reminded afresh how to stand up for an idea, how to see more wisely through it, but there still remains for me a question about how religious or metaphysical wonder fits in, the wonder of a religious transcendent that is not open to doubt, that is absolutely certain. And all the more so because for some time Saul has been publishing luminous pieces, provocatively luminous pieces, in journals that take such certainty for granted. And then I realized that the answer to my question was hidden in plain view back in his 1997 answer to my critics in Prosaics Evolving. I coined the term prosaics, Saul wrote, but I no longer own it. I think of prosaics really as a certain set of evolving attitudes and questions, rather than a hard and fast set of theses. In fact, it has led me to all sorts of positions I had not initially imagined. These positions do not logically entail each other, but share a certain spirit. It is entirely possible to accept one of them but not the rest, or to develop the potentials of prosaics in quite other ways. Prosaics could never become a fixed dogma without ceasing to be prosaics. And I guess my final word to that is, what a marvelous no-lose place for any beloved theory to end up. So thank you, Saul.
So we're a little bit over time, but we have we just there's so many profound things to talk about. Can we have to do a few questions? Yes. Okay. Well, how about we have the first presenters, the presenters come up here and sit down, and then we'll answer. We'll have several questions, and you will be. Yeah, and we're going to start right here.
So I'm going to accost Andrew while he's still making his way to the front, going back to old times, since I've known him since I was an undergraduate and he was my first instructor of Russian literature. But first I want to thank all three of you, Robin, Andrew, and Caryl, for those incredibly powerful and moving presentations. I mean, it's just a surfeit of emotions and ideas that you've left us with, and it's going to take a long time to process them all. Unfortunately for Andrew, he gave me easy bait to go after, and that is, Andrew, so you completely, it was really, really interesting and brilliant as usual and made me want to think about things from different perspectives, but you completely misrepresent Goethe's Faust, okay? Because Faust, that Faust is not looking to get out of work. He doesn't fit your thesis. He's not looking to stop work. He's not lazy. What is it actually that Goethe's Faust, what's the deal he makes with the devil? What does he challenge? He says to the devil, this is what has to happen for you to get to have my soul. What is it? It's not work. It's what you're putting your hand on is a tradition actually that goes back to kind of like the land of cocaine and medieval sort of, it's more of like a peasant, the lower class ideal of freedom from work, right? Of the peasants and the land of cocaine and things like that. No, I'll answer the question for you. And by the way, I can pick on Andrew this way because, yeah, he's known me since I was 18. So what Goethe's Faust, what he says, hey, Mephistopheles, this is what has to happen for you to get to drag me off to hell, is something very, very different. He doesn't want to stop working. He wants to experience a moment, a singular moment, where he will shout out, Verweile doch, du bist so schön, which means he wants to say to the moment, stay, linger, you are so beautiful. He wants a moment of transcendence, the moment where he wants time to be suspended. He wants to experience that time suspending, Eliot's moment in the rose garden when the rain beats, when time stops. And he gets it after hard work. How does Faust 2 end? How does Faust 2 end? He says it, he says, Verweile doch, du bist so schön, because he has been a hard-working statesman. He has transformed the land. He's looking out as like a North German kind of landscape, and he's looking out over this landscape of canals and irrigation, and the land is flourishing and everything, and he has done this. He's worked his butt off to do that. So your talk was fabulous and interesting, but as long as you like change the way you use Goethe's Faust in it, it'll be right on.
Again, I'm just using Goethe's Faust Part 1, not Faust Part 2. So
I want the moment.
no, he says he wants the moment of transcendence in Part 1, but he doesn't. All he does is seduce poor Gretchen, and that passage about avoiding work is his word. So Part 2 perhaps, but Part 2 is, I don't know. Well, lots of people do, because most of them can't read it, including me, and find it pretty much unreadable. But okay, I mean, you're much more a specialist in German literature than I am, so I'll grant you Part 2, but I won't grant you Part 1.
Hello, everyone. It's nice to see you, Andrew. I'm Parnisha Jones, the director of Northwestern University Press. And you see me in this hat. Now, I wore this hat for a reason. I wore it because of Saul. Because Saul, every time he would meet me, he had on one of the best hats, best fedoras, reminded me of all the great gentlemen I've known in my life. So I wore this hat. It has feathers, yes, and it's green and it's springtime. But I just wanted to say that this is truly extraordinary. The last 2 days, I am so grateful to all the people who have showed up to just pay a really, really great thank you to somebody who's just changed academics, changed everything in literature, changed thought, changed religion, changed poets. I'm a poet by trade, but now I have to work in publishing in so many different ways. You have really, I just wanted to say, if I don't get, because you have all your fans here, I just want to say that you've really, really been instrumental, not just in Northwestern, but I think just instrumental in just how literature forms in how we talk to the rest of the world. So I just, before the questions get started, I really want to just say thank you very, very much.
Okay, about the wonderful paper of Andrew. It looks like in your interpretation, the devil is learning with time. The first naive, the devil believes that he can offer all kinds of goods to people and seduce them. But the more educated, more sophisticated devil of the 20th century, he offers suffering and pain and struggle, and this is the devil of the Soviet or German, which is what Thomas Mann's novel is about, the seduction for suffering. And eventually even for dying. And this is the offer you cannot resist. This is absolutely irresistible. And so it's an interesting kind of, you can even see a watershed, because the early 20th century, the devil is still a traditional bourgeois, so to say, devil in history of soldier, by Stravinsky and so forth. But then after the First World War, the game is changing. Okay, and about the wonderful paper of Caryl. Well, one of my favorite words by Tolstoy is "Energia заблуждения." That I'm ready to write, but I miss what I'm missing. He says, preparing to write Anna Karenina. Everything is ready for me to write, but what is missing is energia заблуждения. I translated energy of wandering lost. I don't know whether it is satisfactory or not. How to say energia заблуждения? Yeah. Shklovsky put it as a title of his book too. And Shklovsky said, нужно уметь ошибаться, нужно незнание. One have to learn to make mistake. One have to learn not to know. And this is what I sense in the discussion of the Prosaic, which perhaps goes astray from its original meaning, that it becomes increasingly positive. It is glorifying this kind of non-determinist, the everyday. We know all of that. It becomes a positive. It becomes an ideal, if you wish, of itself. But I would like to ask you, what do you think about this kind of making a fool of yourself, getting yourself into a situation which you, well, dearly regret and or think, how could I do that? Or
You're fading out, Boris.
Not knowing, this what Shklovsky said, umieć ошибаться, to be able to make mistakes.
Be able to make a mistake.
Yeah.
And Lindsay Chardon gave a wonderful talk this morning for those who remember her understanding of what it's like to work for Microsoft, and not just to work over your own proofs at your own time, but to actually have to create a community with people. And failure was one of the things you had to learn how to do, and remember that if you're not failing enough at the time, you're not setting a high enough standard. So forget success. That's something all of us people knows why we're here. But if we really have to compete in a world that gives us no security at all, not just a question of writing well, but actually living well and having returns coming in for which we must answer, then you've got to continue to fail because you continue to ask more of yourself. And I think Tolstoy was such a genius, Boris, that he was not able to satisfy the world as he knew must exist within the concept of structure. And this is Saul's most wonderful insight about how Tolstoy writes. This is him putting in details that no one had gotten around to learning or talking about, but that suddenly someone tells us that Dolokhov has a mother and a crippled sister, and therefore the story hasn't gone anywhere. We know nothing more after that point, but we do know that whoever writes a novel, whoever creates, has got to be reminding the reader that even the creator of the great novel is in a state of ignorance about a great deal, and that this is what gives us a sense of life. So even structure fails in a way which makes it less artificial. It's a very strange mix. And I think Shklovsky, who has a wonderful understanding of what it means to be surprised by a detail. Again, in Saul's universe, to be surprised by a detail is to be surprised by something that doesn't add up or recur, something that's contingent, something that comes in, disappears, comes in, isn't followed through. And this is, and here I follow Saul 100%, and it's a prosaic insight, something which is precisely telling us how we must structure our lives by telling us that great literary work can't exist with this core surprisingness, the significant meaning of a detail in the present that isn't followed through either in the past or the future.
Yes.
Just one quick comment on the theme of not working, or the desire not to work for our doctors, and that is when, Andrew, when you were talking, I was wondering if this suspicion of the diabolic nature or aspects of not wanting to work might somewhat explain the medical establishment's traditional distrust of placebos, right? It was just something, this distrust of placebos, even when they're proven to heal and to cure disease, but somehow it's not the right way because it hasn't been earned the right way. Anyways, just a thought, and with that.
I know there are probably a lot of people who want to speak, so I will be as brief as possible. I just want to have I just have a suggestion about prosaics and wonder. So I would suggest that one of Saul's motivations in creating prosaics from the very beginning has been to rescue not just the everyday, but reality itself from ideology. Most of those ideologies have been atheistic. There seems to be, Saul seems to have an understanding from the beginning that these ideologies do a great disservice to reality and the wonder which reality by its very nature invites. Another one of Saul's concepts, very closely related to prosaics, is contingency. We all know how Saul uses the concept contingency, but contingency has a dual meaning. One is accidental, contrary to necessity, possibility. Another dimension of contingency is giftedness. And so one might speculate, I'll conclude on this point, that Saul is well versed in the history of philosophy, becoming ever more versed in the history of theology. I wonder if there's a way of connecting Saul's respect for reality itself, for its contingency, rescuing it from atheistic ideologies, to one of the most profound ways that reality invites wonder, and that is St. Thomas Aquinas's third way. And that is that the very presence of the world as contingent, the world exists, but clearly not on its own. Its very existence implies or entails a gifter or a creator. It's contingent, and therefore it entails a type or level of being that exists by its very nature. So it may be, Saul had suggested that, prosaics is now inviting all sort of interpretations. I would like to suggest that one of those interpretations is rescuing reality from atheistic ideologies so that it can invite wonder by its very nature.
Well, first, Andrew, what I think you ought to do is cut that talk to about 1,000 words, focus it on the AI point, and then it will make an absolutely wonderful op-ed, about AI using, the devil and foul. It'll be absolutely wonderful. That's what I think you should do. For me, I'm learning so much about myself. I'm hearing how I am heard by other people, and they hear things. Well, Dalya, knows things about me I didn't know anybody knew. And each of you, well, there are those who took it in new directions, applying it somewhere like Todd or Sandy or Matt, But then there are those who also, explicate it in a way like Robin. I had no idea you paid attention to my sentences, for God's sake. I had no idea anybody paid attention. And then when you quoted that passage about crime and punishment, I thought, that was one of my favorite passages in the book, and nobody's ever noticed it. Finally somebody noticed it. Well, you can't expect people to notice. It's buried in chapter 4, but I learned so much, Caryl, from the way you read it. Of course, we've been talking about this for years, but still, the way you found new stuff, I found new stuff here. I'd just like to add one thing. I'm sorry Larry Lipking left, because this would kind of thinking of him. At the very beginning of my thinking, now this is when I'm still an undergraduate, I was taking a class on later 18th century English literature, the Tristram Shandy period. And I read an essay by Northrop Frye called Towards Defining an Age of Sensibility. And he first has this idea that what made that age what it was is that instead of cultivating finished products, it throws the emphasis on the process. And that was the most wonderful idea, and it's been with me through developing it, you know, basically my whole life. And that's part of, you know, see, Caryl, this, you know, yes, you're absolutely right. Those 163 Tolstoyan conclusions were playing around, right? I mean, you know, of course, yes, they were playing around. They were trying things out, and that's I think what you call was at the spirit of a great deal of what I do, no matter how strongly I assert it, is trying it out, not being sure of it. But the only way you can know what the truth is really to defend it vigorously, have it criticized like Sandy does, right? And or filtered through the you know, the minds of others. And then, but if you don't commit yourself to it, that never happens. So no matter how strong it sounds like, I'm still, you know, trying it out. Well, like the way I teach by impersonation, you know, I write by impersonating myself, right? I mean, that's the only way I could figure out, you know, what I think. You know, one of my friends, who's even older than me, likes to say that death is no longer a rumor, right? And, you know, why, you can't waste the time. You gotta really figure out what's true, and the only way to do that is to put yourself out there and get shot down and see what's wrong. The only I'll say about the religious thing, it seems to me, Katie just reminded me of this, and it's what Dostoevsky said, that you don't have to think about faith as a matter of certainty or dogma, right? It can be, you know, doubt can be absolutely essential to faith. That's what Dostoevsky, you know, thought of faith. And in that case, you know, it's openness to openness, you know, is still there. And that's part of what I hear in Keep the Conversation Going. So thank you all. This was, I will never forget. This is so, you know, such a wonderful, how could you hear me that way? It's just wonderful. So, no.